In my whole life, I have known no wise people over a broad subject matter area who didn't read all the time. None. Zero. You'd be amazed at how much Warren reads and at how much I read. My children laugh at me. They think I'm a book with a couple of legs sticking out. I constantly see people rise in life who are not the smartest, sometimes not even the most diligent, but they are learning machines. They go to bed every night a little wiser than they were when they woke up. And boy, does that help, particularly when you have a long run ahead of you. Spend each day trying to be a little wiser than when you woke up, day by day. And at the end of the day, if you live long enough, like most people, you will get out of life what you deserve.
And if you want to spend each day trying to be a little bit wiser than you were when you woke up, go to rationalvc.com, sign up to our newsletter, where after every single episode, we provide you a breakdown of the core concepts from the book we go over. And we do it from the context of our own lives. So we're not giving you bite-sized little chunks of what's said in the book. We're not short-forming the content of the book. Rather, we're just providing you a view of what we've learned. To note, we revisit these books and we come back to them all the time. So don't expect us to get everything right. But this book, Poor Charlie's Almanac, what do you make of it?
This book, we have said time and time again, along with Nassim Taleb's Inserto series, so the 5 books of the Inserto plus Poor Charlie's Almanac, the teachings and philosophies are the foundation of the Rational VC brand since inception 4 or 5 years ago now. And it's interesting, you see how much of, you said this before we recorded, a lot of Munger's ideas here are not too dissimilar from Taleb. This is the book where, after I left the, you want to call it investment banking world, and went into sort of startup blockchain crypto space. After 5 months, I was like, whoa, this is exactly what I do not want to be involved with, especially back then where it was archaic.
ICO craze back then.
The ICO craze back then. And so I wanted to go completely the other way. I wanted to seek out the rationalists of the rationalists. And that doesn't mean this, whatever rationalist means on the interwebs, which is there's like communities like Less Wrong or whatever it's called, like the SPF, whatever, some
shots fired.
I'm not involved with these things. I wanted the traditional sense of rationalists, which is your Nassim Taleb's, your Charlie Mungers, etc. And yeah, so I started devouring those books, and you got into it as well, pretty much around the same time. And those philosophies and teachings have formed and shaped the Rational brand. So this book, I have the humongous version, which is like 50 kilos, not really 50 kilos, but it's a very heavy book that you typically have to pay over $100 for. And thanks to John Collison, Tamara Winter, and the Stripe Press team, they've made it very affordable and accessible. So you can get the new version for about $20 or £20 in a more compact version. Still the same content. Nothing's been skimmed off the actual original book. And you can also, we'll put the link in the show notes. You can read the book for free online. Stripe Press have made a dedicated Poor Charlie's Almanac webpage, which is the most, as people in tech, I can confirm myself. Me personally, it's the most beautiful UX, UI, navigation, readable book website I've ever seen, or just website, period. And they also have the audiobook version for free. So the link is in the show notes if you want to follow along. You can actually access this book for free digitally. But if you want the hardback, it's now very easily accessible and affordable thanks to Stripe Press. So I'm very thankful that they've made an all-time classic. This is a very Lindy book. It may have not been around more than 20 years, 19 years now. But the ideas are Lindy, and it will be around for, I think, decades or even centuries to come. So that's what I think of it. It's been pivotal and foundational in the forming of our brand. The teachings and philosophies have shaped the Rational VC brand, which is why the first few episodes since pivoting, we've done these books. Anything you want to add?
The concept of Rational VC, like you say, is built on a lot of these factors, but a couple of things to say. The first is this book is Lindy, not because it was written recently, like you say, and not necessarily because the ideas are old, but actually because it's a collection of his speeches and his views over time. So not only do you get like his original ideas and concepts and how he'd been building on them from 30, 40, 50 years ago, what you also get is the development of those ideas over time in the book.
Yeah.
So he even says in the book in different sections, like, oh, I thought about this and that and that. And then actually over time, I've been able to step away from the craziness of life and rethink and rejig my ideas around it. So you get a progression of Charlie in little snippets throughout the book as well.
Yes. And usual disclaimers, let's get it out the way. One episode will not do this book any justice.
No justice.
No justice. We'll revisit Poor Charlie's Almanac again and again in the future. Maybe episode 100, maybe episode whatever in the future. This is a book to be studied, not read, as we usually say. You got to reread. You pick up new things every time. Especially, these episodes are not book reviews. They're deep dives, if you want to say. We go deep into the book, but also applying our own life experiences to it. So as we reread over the years with improved understanding, life experiences, maturity, you gain a different perspective every time you read it. So it's worth doing episodes again and again. And it's honestly such a dense book. I was saying to you before the recording, we should have maybe done something like, someone tweeted at us, they said, guys, Poor Charlie's Almanac episode, maybe you do multiple episodes on it.
Part of the reason is probably because they got tired of listening to us talk for 5 hours, 10 hours straight on the
Inserto series.
Inserto podcasts.
But, kudos to someone like Brett Hall, who does a lot of David Deutsch books on the Theory of Knowledge podcast. He does, he tweeted at me, he was explaining, I think, something like he does a couple of chapters per episode. So that's very, very dense. But we want to make it dense enough, but still,
choppy
to an extent. But anyway, this is the format. We're going to do them again and again. I think that's all the disclaimers out the way.
Also, one more disclaimer. If you can see Cyrus's hat, we've stitched it at the beginning of the video if you're watching on YouTube. But if you're listening, he's got the OG Berkshire Hathaway Incorporated established 1965 hat on. And his head is so big that the seams are breaking on the cap.
Indeed. So it's actually, I need a haircut. And,
yeah.
So yeah, we have the hat here. But
we have a private joke where every single time we have different head shapes between our friend group. Mr. Ali Carpet or Tehran Tony has a really flat head to the back of his head, and he's obviously
perpendicular.
Bald. It's literally perpendicular. But for Cyrus here, we just take the piss because he just has a ginormous head.
Small brain inside. Okay, so when asked to describe himself in one word, Charlie Munger chose rational. He knows he's subject to the same biases affecting all other humans, and he has trained himself to recognize when the biases are active and how to limit their damage. If you want to make better decisions, you need to seek truth.
Oh, yes.
So it's funny. I've highlighted in here and underlined the word rational and also seek truth. Rationalvc.com. 3 long-standing core values: authenticity, truth-seeking, and long-termism. So before we get into the actual book, one other thing I would say, I think it was episode 18 of Rational VC a few years ago, long before the pivot where we started covering books. But if people want to scroll all the way back, I think it's 18 or somewhere around episode 18, where I did an episode on Peter Kaufman and Charlie Munger's teachings around multidisciplinary thinking. And it's about a 20-minute episode, but we had a lot of great feedback on that. On YouTube, on whatever audio version, you can hear it everywhere. So you may want to go back and listen to that, because some of those ideas do actually pop up again here. And if you're thinking, who is Peter Kaufman? Peter Kaufman, at the time of writing this book anyway, I believe, Peter Kaufman was the CEO and chairman of Glen Air Inc. And he is also supporting Charlie Munger as part of the Daily Journal Corporation as a director, I believe. And so Peter Kaufman, who had worked with Charlie Munger for so many years, decided to take a year out of work to write Poor Charlie's Almanac, because it's quite funny. Somewhere in the Poor Charlie's Almanac, I actually read a quote from Munger in one of his speeches. Munger says, they said, why don't you write a book for us? And Munger's like, the problem, with paraphrasing, the problem with you people is you just want actionable, quick bit advice. For me to write a book, it takes a lot of time. I don't have the time unless someone else does it. So Peter Kaufman, a good friend and I guess a mentee of Munger, came along years later, took a year out of work of his very busy schedule running companies, and he put together a collection of Munger's essays, talks, speeches, commencement speeches, and put them all together in this one book. There is some overlap. So before we get into it, and I want to hand it over to you, Iman, but before we get into it, the format of this book is essentially, it's only 4 chapters. So chapter 1 is a portrait of Charlie Munger, which is, of course, written by Peter Kaufman. Chapter 2 is remembering the children on Charlie. So all of Charlie Munger's kids give their take on things. And chapter 3 is the Munger approach to life, learning, and decision making. Chapter 4, which is the final chapter, consists of 11 speeches. So chapter 4 is basically 300 or so pages, and it wraps up the book. But it consists of 11 speeches. And these are talks such as the Harvard School commencement speech, talk at the USC Gold School of Law, different talks at different, I guess, charitable events, universities, etc. Some of them do have overlapping ideas because there's so much knowledge and it's such a dense book. We're going to try and limit the overlapping talks, but we're going to cover all of the main ideas that Munger goes through. So before we actually get into even chapter 1, 2, 3, we'll kick off with the foreword by Buffett on Munger. How Munger, the name of this book, Poor Charlie's Almanac, stems from Poor Richard's Almanac, which is Benjamin Franklin's book, because Benjamin Franklin was the idol to Munger. How, I guess, Munger is what Munger is to us, Franklin was to Munger. And Munger followed a lot of Benjamin Franklin's virtues, pretty much all of them, most of them, except for, he says somewhere, where Franklin had like multiple wives or multiple partners or something.
Yeah.
Munger wasn't into that. If Ben suggested saving pennies, Charlie raised the stakes. This is Buffett talking about Munger. If Ben said be prompt, Charlie said be early. Life under Ben's rules began to look positively cushy compared with the rigor demanded by Munger. And, on partner selection, look first for someone both smarter and wiser than you are. After locating him or her, ask him not to flaunt his superiority so that you may enjoy acclaim for the many accomplishments that sprang from his thoughts and advice. Seek a partner who will never second guess you nor sulk when you make expensive mistakes. Look also for a generous soul who will put up his own money and work for peanuts. Finally, join with someone who will constantly add to the fun as you travel a long road together. That's Buffett talking about Munger. And that's also, I guess, how I talk about Iman. So hand it over to you.
The first thing that popped out here is across the entire foreword, but specific to Warren's review of Munger, of Charlie, is how much he speaks about him in esteem. Like, he loves this guy. All he does is give praise to how he couldn't be who he is if it weren't for Charlie. So that's the first thing that jumps out. You see it across the whole foreword as well, around how people are just so grateful to have Charlie Munger in their life. The one bit of the first foreword around what Warren says that really jumped out to me is where he talks about, in Ben's famous essay, Ben Franklin that is, he says that only an older mistress makes sense. And he goes on to give 8 very good reasons as to why this is so. His clincher, and lastly, they are so grateful. What jumped out for me here is you can idolize someone like how Munger idolizes Franklin, or how Buffett idolizes Charlie. But there are specific parts of everybody's life that you don't have to abide by. So there's this like God complex that some people might have for someone like Charlie Munger, or, in our previous books around, Taleb or whoever. And that's because they have amazing ideas and they are like profoundly changing your life. But it doesn't mean every single part of that individual's life needs to be abided by. And you don't have to like put them on such a pedestal as to copy everything they do.
Yes.
So that was like understanding where to draw the line was what came out of that for me, is like, That's what I really like. The final thing I say is the value in having a partner in life, be it romantic, be it business, whatever, is like, it's not just the most valuable thing, but it's also the hardest thing to find. So what you find in this book is it tells the story of how actually Munger and Buffett actually became close with each other. It was in their fucking, like, I think Munger was 35 or something, and Warren was in his late 20s. They'd been in and around each other, and even Munger had worked for Buffett's grandfather. We'll get into that later.
Grocery store, yeah.
But they hadn't actually met. So it shows that it actually takes time to develop those relationships. They compound in a way that you can't foresee.
Yep.
And it shows that from how grateful every single one of the sort of reviews of, if you will, of Munger across the beginning of the book, that finding a partner that, or a dad, or a, you know, someone who's your mentor, who is so valuable to you, is something that's not only hard to come by, but it should be like taken with two hands. As soon as you see it, you should grab it with two hands.
Exactly. And the next page is just a couple of short paragraphs, a rebuttal Munger on Buffett, where we're not going to read the whole thing, but, you know, Munger is playing it cool. He says, there's this myth that, you know, I've been this great enlightener of Warren. He didn't need much enlightenment. I frankly think I get more credit than I deserve, yada, yada. So he's obviously showing humility there, and talking about how phenomenal Warren is in his own regard. Moving on, still kind of before we get into chapter 1, that was the foreword. The introduction is by Peter D. Kaufman. So or some people say Kaufman, some say Kaufman.
Yeah, I would say Kaufman, but I don't know.
Let's go with Kaufman. Peter Kaufman, who that's going to be new for me, because
you always say Kaufman,
even in the old episode.
Kaufman.
Maybe this is the German influence on me, Deutsch.
Kaufman. Yeah, it's a German name, right? I don't know.
A delivery, by the way, quick side note, a delivery driver, DPD in Germany, was very angry at me because he was delivering a parcel. Said, do you speak something Deutsch? He was basically getting at, do you speak? And I was like, no, I speak English. I will soon learn Deutsch. And he got very angry. He said something in German. He's like, you need to learn Deutsch. You're in Germany. And I was like, correct, I will learn. But English, language of the world. You must know English. And he got really pissed off. So
yeah, imagine going to other people's countries and telling them their language is obsolete.
Trucks. So Peter Kaufman, in the introduction, says he touches on a few things, and you got to remember Peter Kaufman has always looked up to Munger. One of the reasons he put this book together, and this is more than 40 years ago now. This is Lindy. He says Charlie's unique worldview, what he calls his multidisciplinary approach, is a self-developed model for clear and simple thinking. Yet his concepts and models are anything but simplistic. Notice how well Charlie's thinking stands the test of time. The earliest talk in this collection is almost 20 years old, now 40 years old, yet it is as relevant today as the day he first delivered it. So the fact that a lot of these talks were more than just over 40 years ago now, and they're still relevant and growing in relevancy, that goes to show, that stands by the Lindy effect, which we speak of, and why we stand by these ideas. He says, as soon as you will discover Charlie's observations and conclusions are based on fundamental human nature, basic truths, and core principles from a wide range of disciplines, which basically sums up Rational VC. If you go to the landing page, rationalvc.com, it's pretty much along those lines.
The way he talks about Munger is really good. He says, where else would you find Demosthenes, Cicero juxtaposed against Johnny Carson, or today's investment managers set against Nietzsche, Galileo, and a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest?
Brilliant. He says, the things that Charlie's become known for: lifelong learning, intellectual curiosity, sobriety, avoidance of envy and resentment, reliability, learning from the mistakes of others, perseverance, objectivity, willingness to test one's own beliefs, and many more. He well knows and wisely exploits the traditional role of a storyteller as a purveyor of complex and detailed information. Again, now, the next part, touching on Rational VC, Charlie places a premium on life decisions over investment decisions, because personally speaking, myself, I think when you sort out your life, as Taleb talks about, you need to focus on working towards having a clear mind. When you work through a lot of that, I think the better life decisions you have and the more clarity of mind you have, which is not easy to achieve, it leads to better decisions in your wider life, in your job as well, if that's as an investor, if that's as a startup founder, and so on and so forth. And lastly, he says, rather than focusing on things like portfolio, business strategy, and CAPM or beta, all this stuff, rather they center on fundamental truth, human accomplishment, human foibles, and the arduous path to wisdom. So I found that brilliant, and the unconventional way of thinking and his extraordinary work ethic, the twin fonts of his amazing successes. The 11th talk in this book, which we'll get onto later, is kind of Munger's central ideas put together. Is a special edition of the psychology of human misjudgment that Charlie created especially for this book, combining a lot of his talks and ideas from many decades of experience into one book. And lastly, before I hand it over to you again, Iman, the layout of this book, which I've already explained earlier regarding the chapters and the talks, Kaufman says, I encourage you to further pursue these subjects on your own, because we're going to talk about many, many subjects, many different disciplines. And this is just a starting point. This is why in one of the prior Taleb episodes, we said why Taleb and Munger have shaped the Rational VC brand with their philosophies and teachings is because they'll name drop so many of history's greatest thinkers. And it's a starting point for, okay, after these books, then we have to go and explore those Lindy books and ideas. So that's it pretty much. We do have, John Collison of Stripe Press gave some nice words earlier in the book as well. You can go read on the free version of the book, which we'll put the link below on the Stripe website. And that's it. I mean, we can kick things off with chapter 1, A Portrait of Charles T. Munger by Michael Broggie. The first thing that sticks out to me, of course, he gives the usual story, which you touched on, about how Warren and Charlie met, which was decades after they were kids, but they worked in the same grocery store, which was for Buffett's grandfather, I believe, where Charlie speaks so highly of Buffett's grandfather, who taught him so many of the virtues, values, ethics, and life principles that he knows to this day. And so on raising children himself, Charlie's teachers remember a smart kid who was also inclined to be a bit of a wiseacre. He enjoyed challenging the conventional wisdom of teachers and fellow students with his ever-increasing knowledge gained through voracious reading, particularly biographies. Charlie's parents, Al and Florence Munger, encouraged reading and gave each of their children several books at Christmas, usually devoured by that night. I want to get your thoughts on this, because today we see so many parents, I guess from my view, the majority in society, who hand their kids a smartphone or device, and it's TikTok or whatever, and the speed at which people go through, like they spend less than 3 seconds on each, whatever it's called, TikTok or Shorts or whatever, and on to the next one. A recurrent theme that I found, I mean, some of the people who are not just, I guess, erudite or intellectual, but also seem to have a good idea of life, where they're happy, helping others, living the idea of a good life, seems to have been raised around a lot of books. For example, past guest on the show, Jim O'Shaughnessy of OSV, he spoke of how when his 3 kids, one of whom is Patrick, when his 3 kids were young, they were children, they'd come up to him, Daddy, asking him a question. And Jim would say, he'd say, you can go look it up over there, pointing to the home library. So I think this point of raising children around books is paramount and crucial. But I want to get your thoughts on this start of chapter 1, the first few pages. Yeah,
I mean, he's right in that the people that are the most voracious readers tend to be the most successful in later life. I guess there's a couple of things there. Munger came up, we'll get to what he describes as a circle of competence later, but Munger came up in an environment where your circle of competence was directly attributable to the things that you would have access to learning when you're younger. So by design, if you're raised in a household where there's loads of books, you're going to be more inclined to read more books, to get a wider variety of understanding of different stuff, and therefore build like this energy and love for learning. That looks a bit different today, because I think actually information overload is what you have access to. So technically what you can find with this like online world that kids get access to is people can go and get like people can go down specific niches a lot faster and like learn a crap load about that niche. Instead of being a jack of all trades, they can become a master of one specific thing very quickly. That's beneficial because it means that people can follow their interests much more deeply.
Yes.
What's not beneficial is that a lot of people fall into the trap of the world of information that's out there and then become a master of nothing because they want to learn at a surface level everything. What books give you and help you learn is you fall into the narrative that the book puts together. And this goes back to a lot of the narrative fallacy stuff. We like, as humans are designed for narrative fallacies. We love hearing stories. It's no surprise that the book starts with the story of Munger's life because it hooks you into who he is as a person. It's no surprise that everyone's singing his praises in the foreword and in the beginning of the book, including his own family, because they want to create this link to the individual and how he's grown over time so that it fits into this Procrustean bed of who you want him to be. Why am I saying all of this? Is because the value that comes from reading, the value that comes from learning through story, actually really only ever comes from books. It's very hard to project that at a deep enough level where you give kids a phone and you want them to like watch a video on something, or if they have a question, they Google it. Like, that's not going to get you satisfaction around what you've learned. And on top of that, because you don't get the satisfaction, you haven't gone through the arduous reading of multiple pages to get to an answer, you end up not remembering that thing, or it doesn't become part and parcel of who you are as you develop your brain. Anyway, that's a separate thing that we've gone into detail about around maybe anti-fragile as well in the episode on how to learn more effectively. But the book is very interesting in that it starts with that.
Yes, it's a crucial point because, of course, reading underpins a lot of rational VC. I want to move on still on that chapter 1 on Munger and talking about, Munger, he learned firsthand the value of financial independence. A lot of what we're going to get into. Munger talks about, not overspending your income, creating runway and investments, and focusing on finances in a way where it offers you independence. There's a very good quote paraphrasing Munger is one of my favorites. It says, "I always wanted to be rich. I desperately wanted it. I wanted to be rich like Warren, but I didn't want to be rich because I wanted Ferraris. I wanted the financial independence." So he's always drumming on about financial independence.
Just on that point, the reason he wanted financial independence is because he grew up in the Great Depression and he saw how his family was able to weather that storm because his father was a man of repute and he had money and supported his brother-in-law and other people to keep their businesses intact. Yeah. Sorry, but anyway.
No. This is beautiful. So the sticky notes I have here, the importance of family and helping one another. So Charlie's grandfather was a respected federal judge, and his father followed in his footsteps to become a prosperous lawyer. Long story short, in that era that you're talking about, in this Great Depression following that era, because of the miserable economy and drought-damaged crops, the bank's farm-based clients were defaulting on loans. So one of his extended family members, I believe it was Uncle Tom, Charlie's Uncle Tom, owned a bank in Stromsburg, Nebraska. And during this period, due to the miserable economy, a lot of the clients of the bank had defaulted on notes. At the time, it was a lot of money. The bank had $35,000 in uncollectible notes when when Uncle Tom called Grandpa Munger for support. So Charlie's grandpa at the time got a sort of call for support, and his grandfather, the judge, risked nearly half of his assets by exchanging $35,000 in sound first mortgages for the bank's week's loans, thus enabling Uncle Tom, to open his doors after Roosevelt's bank holiday. The judge eventually recovered most of his investment, but not until a great many years later. Judge Munger also sent his daughter's husband, a musician, to pharmacy school and helped him buy a well-located pharmacy that had closed because of the Depression. The business prospered and secured the future for Charlie's aunt. Charlie learned that by supporting each other, the Mungers weathered the worst economic collapse in the nation's history. This is what I recently, when I read this, I told similar points to some relatives or family members. And after reading this, I called them all up again. And I said, how sometimes I don't know, maybe I have this behavior where I get on everyone's case around me. I'm like, you're being sloppy, you're being too lazy. You need to read this. You're like, this is this health thing. Dr. Andy Galpin said this. Go read this. I'm like, Munger, the importance of family. I've been telling you, we will need to focus on that. We need to focus on the long term, stick together for decades, help each other. So beautiful. I think what he touches on here, and Munger continued that into old age. And we're going to talk about that, but how when he got divorced, he already had children, but then when he remarried, Nancy also had her own children. So their families kind of combined, it was 8 children.
Yeah.
And so Munger was looking after, he treated Nancy's kids as his own, basically.
No wonder he didn't need a mistress. He had 8 children with 2 wives.
Exactly. And yeah, I mean, pretty much more ideas in as always, we're still on chapter 1, but Charlie,
Should we talk about
Please.
The concept of family is really important to Charlie, and obviously that's based on his childhood, but it's how you go from, like, what that informed him to do later on in life that was super interesting, because it meant that he had to weather the difficulty of having a job and I say difficulty in inverted commas, but it's not a job he enjoyed, in being a lawyer, because he had to provide for his family and he had to create wealth. He even went into property, I think it talks about in the beginning of the book, where, he was working in real estate, making a healthy money on the side. He continued to be a lawyer so that he could provide the financial life that his family would require. It shows that sometimes you need to sacrifice stuff in order to get to where you want to, and do stuff on the side, which we've spoken about extensively on our Inserto series podcasts. Should we move on maybe to how he met Charlie, and towards the end of the chapter where, discusses their interactions?
I will. And just before we move on, I want to touch on... He also discovered physics after enrolling in a basic course to fulfill an academic requirement for science. And in particular, he was impressed by the process followed by physicists such as Albert Einstein to address the unknown. Physics-like problem solving was to become a passion for Charlie, and is a skill he considers helpful in framing the problems of life. He has often stated that anyone who wants to be successful should study physics, because its concepts and formulas so beautifully demonstrate the powers of sound theory. We've mentioned before, now that we're on this path of every episode, we explore a Lindy book and find ideas that you can use in business and life, kind of multidisciplinary studies. We are going to be covering, Feynman in the future on some episodes, Richard Feynman. So physics is paramount, and it goes to show the depth of Charlie's studies and the importance he places.
The introduction of Charlie and Warren, because the reality is that these two have been known as partners for decades. Everybody knows them, they go hand in hand. Although Warren might have the plaudits publicly and everybody loves Warren Buffett and his wealth, actually the two are, the two very best friends publicly anyway. So the way they met is super interesting, because they've lived a life that's been interconnected. Charlie worked for Warren Buffett's grandfather in a grocery store. He learned the value of hard work and how he was whipped as a young, not physically, but whipped into shape by his grandfather. And he would work 12-hour days without any lunch breaks, stuff like that. So he values a lot of what he learned from the Buffett family. Yeah. He knew of Warren. He didn't know Warren.
Yes.
So they weren't close. So I think what the story is a doctor family friend of Charlie Munger, when he was raising his fund, or when he was raising capital to deploy in real estate.
He was looking to leave law. He was still practicing law. It was towards the end of that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And so he goes and finds someone that's willing to invest. That guy's not really bothered in investing or care about the strategy of investing that Charlie is pitching him. But what he ends up doing is saying, I'm going to invest in you. I think it was $100,000 at the time, which is a lot of money specific to, I think it was the 50s or 60s, something like that. So he commits that and he says, all right, why are you investing in me? Like, if you don't give a shit about my strategy, why are you investing? He's like, you remind me of a guy called
Warren Buffett from our local town. You should meet him. We're going to host a dinner. You're going to be in town. So Charlie was actually coming back to Omaha, I believe, to take care of his family estate. I believe his father had just passed away.
No. So Warren's raising his fund.
But Charlie was back to sort out his family's affairs and estate and everything.
Yeah, exactly.
And they said, you two should meet. We're hosting a dinner. And he turns up. He'd never met Warren. And they instantly hit it off. This is a famous story. It's been told many times. You can read it elsewhere. But basically, they hit it off. And everyone who was at the dinner table said the whole dinner was basically, the focus was on these two, back and forth, kind of like a game of tennis, of just intellectual.
Imagine being at a dinner and you've got two people just sat at the side of the table, not listening to any conversation, being completely antisocial, and not listening to anybody else.
Exactly. And the rest is history. So at that point, Warren already started convincing Charlie that he should leave law practice and go full time into in the investment business, which he already had one foot in. And so they kept in touch through letters, writing long letters to each other for a long period of time, for a few years, until Charlie eventually left, and then they teamed up. So moving on to chapter 2, which is remembering the children on Charlie. So Charlie's several kids, his children, write their messages in this book in chapter 2 as a sort of, I guess he was still alive at this point, but they're writing about their father.
It's quite interesting. So from Wendy Munger, writes about, my dad often used the forum of the family dinner table to try and educate his children. Side note, I know when I was a kid and anybody would try to educate me at a dinner table, it would probably piss me off more than it would, support me to learn new stuff. But actually, I think it shows the value of having actual narrative based or not adult conversations with children in a forum where they feel like they are part of the conversation. I think it helps development a lot. Exactly. Anyway, side note aside, his favorite educational tools were the morality tale, in which someone faced an ethical problem and chose the correct path, and the downward spiral tale, in which someone made the wrong choice and suffered an inevitable series of catastrophic personal and professional losses. His specialty was the downward spiral tale, always focusing on the negative. He could really warm to the topic of apocalyptic consequences. He used such extreme and horrific examples that we were often simultaneously groaning and laughing by the time he finished. He's in a league of his own when it comes to describing negative outcomes and the lessons to be learned from them.
And, she goes on to say, my dad told us that the president then said, this was a terrible mistake and we don't want you to ever make another one like it. But people make mistakes and we can forgive that. You did the right thing, which was to admit your mistake. If you had to try to hide the mistake or cover it up for even a short time, you would be out of this company. As it is, we'd like you to stay. So Charlie used such stories of, where let's say someone made a mistake. They owned up and went to the company president and said, I've made this mistake, yada, yada, rather than hiding it. So Charlie, notes here what you said and what I just read from Wendy Munger. All of these examples, Munger was never saying, kids, you should do this. Kids, you should not do that. He always taught them through stories. And again, the key central idea coming back to family, coming back to raising kids, he really, really had the right idea. And I mean, I was the same. If you're at the dinner table and I was a kid, if you're trying to maybe teach me something, I wouldn't really like, why are you telling me all this? But if you told me through stories, even adults even more than kids learn through stories. The best books, some of the best podcasts is really just stories of people, right? So I think stories are the way to gain the attention of not just children, but most humans.
I think it was a previous Inserto episode, I think it was Skin in the Game, but I might be wrong, where Taleb talks about the value of narrative and the value of stories in religion in particular. The reason that religion has lasted so long, stood the test of time, Lindy, etc., is because you get very complex philosophical questions answered through the lens of stories. Humans are just innately wired that way. So he's essentially just fundamentally using that narrative to his advantage and his kids' advantages.
So another one of Munger's kids, William Borthwick.
Hal.
And he has a couple of key points, learnings from Munger, he says, from his father. He says, do the job right the first time. And this is a brilliant story. I want to keep it, I want to paraphrase it, but it goes back to Minnesota Times. And William Borthwick, one of my jobs as a driving age teen was to pick up and deliver the housekeeper from the town of Cass Lake. This wasn't just a drive down the street. The boat had to be driven across the lake to the marina, where I would hop into the car to drive to town, and then the process was reversed. Part of my job in the morning was to pick up a newspaper while I was in town. One day a big storm blew in, waves, winds, rain, etc. Big time. With all the excitement and difficulty, I did get to town in the morning and returned with the maid, but I forgot the newspaper. Charlie and I had a 1 second or so discussion after I answered the question, where's my paper? In the negative, go back and get the paper and never forget it again. So back I went through the storm to get the paper, bouncing in the waves with the rain sheeting off the boat, thinking to myself that I wasn't going to allow anything like this to ever happen again. So again, the way Munger, people talk about, I guess, nowadays they're not being too tough on kids. This, I think, was the right idea, because he it's kind of like the immigrant parenting style in a way, where he's like, no bullshit. Why did you forget it? Go and get it now. It's like 1 second discussion. And the expectation was, and again, kids, the other thing is kids learn through you.
Yeah.
Kids learn through your actions. So one of the key reasons I think his kids respected him so much and listened to him immediately was because Charlie carried himself. You can't fake it. Really, you might be able to put up a front with kids and pretend you're a person of hardworking, whatever, for a few days or a few months. But Munger really lived that life, and that's why he literally influenced his kids into the right behavior. So when he talked, they listened, they valued what he said because they're like, okay, dad's a serious guy. He doesn't fuck around in life. His life is organized. Everything. When he says go get it, I messed up. I need to go and get it. So.
Just side note, it touches on the mimesis stuff we picked up with Luke Burgess on one of our previous episodes, where Luke is the writer of Wanting, a book that picks up on René Girard's concepts of mimesis, which is based on this, right? It comes from childhood as well, where you act in a way that reflects what you see.
Precisely. And William Borthwick, other than the do the right job the first time through the story I just told, the second one he touches on is be responsible. William lost keys to the car and he dropped it somewhere in a lake. And Munger basically said there wasn't patience for such stupidity. The solution, again, in about 1 second was go out with your friends and keep diving till you get those keys and don't come home without them. William says, after about 2 hours of diving with the sun sinking like a stone, the miraculous glint of metal in the weeds was before my eyes and I could go home. There are a lot of gems from Minnesota because in those days when Charlie worked so hard and so long, that was the only meaningful time we spent with him. During the work weeks, he was off before dawn and home about dinner time, and then studied Standard & Poor's and later would spend a couple of hours on the phone with Warren.
Who do you know that studies the S&P, like actually reads like the rating agency's reviews and reports?
Different breeds. I mean, even now with all the information at hand, but back then I'm sure there was enough distractions for them. But this is Warren reading 500 pages of annual reports a day,
That sandwich between what David Borthwick, his other son, talks about, which is learning the short game of the tennis equivalent of golf's short game, which is putting away volleys at the net. As someone who loves tennis, this is so important, especially back then when the serve and volley game was so big.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's about like he talks about his dad basically spending hours and hours and hours. Using a machine, a ball throwing machine, to actually practice volleys.
Yes.
And what it was showing was, he can he will hammer away at something until he gets it right, and that's like teaching you the value of hard work and doing the simple things right, so that when it comes to an actual match, you can win a game by just putting away those hard to put away volleys because you practice them so much.
Yeah, it goes to I guess if you want to touch on like the Michael Jordans or the Federers of the world or anyone who's great in their field, or if you want to talk about, let's say, the documentary Jiro Dreams of Sushi, the sushi guy.
Don't know.
This guy is obsessed sushi guy in Japan, in Tokyo. If you haven't watched Jiro Dreams of Sushi, Netflix, old documentary, I highly recommend. This guy he has like a 10-seater little sushi place in Tokyo, which is sold out like 1 year in advance.
Jesus.
And it's all about the craftsmanship. I think after like 20 years or something, he still didn't promote his son from dishwasher to he is obsessed with getting with the craft and on practicing the boring. So he's like, you have to practice cutting the sushi for every day for 10 years until maybe I let you into the kitchen next door. And so it sounds like one other end of the extreme.
It sounds like what's his name? I fear not the man who's practiced 1,000 kicks, but a man who's who's practiced one kick 1,000 times.
Which is what his other kid David Borthwick is getting at with the tennis practice that you're talking about. But it was really practicing the boring. What we're talking about here, what David, his son, was talking about, is Munger's insane focus, insane levels of focus. He says, father's ability to Chinese wall off the most intrusive distractions from whatever mental task he was engaged in, a practice alternately amusing and irritating if you were trying to get his attention, accounts as much as anything else for his success.
I think, sorry to cut you off, but I think if someone like Munger lived in today's world and was raised in our world, he would not be Munger, because this thing, your phone, as I'm holding it up, if you're viewing, is such a massive distraction.
Yes.
I can't get any work done unless I've got it outside of the room.
Yeah.
Like how this is so unheard of today, unless you're considered a weirdo in society. I just don't think it exists.
It's because, exactly to your point, you're worried of is an important notification going off? Is someone trying to get hold of? Is there an emergency?
Yeah,
Is
I think
something
it's a
critical?
rewiring of your brain.
It's a rewiring of your brain, and it's fucked up. Like some of the most accomplished people we know in the tech industry and in most industries, they go through mental gymnastics, installing all these fucking tools like Freedom app and Opal and all of this stuff to essentially lock your phone or just make it unusable for a few hours so you can do your work.
I think the effective leaders of today and, before have all had this mental focus and mental clarity. Like you'll see a lot of people just who are quite, at the top of their profession don't get distracted very easily. This is probably more the midwits, the people that actually work under those leaders that have this problem, which is an issue around productivity more generally, to be honest.
If you remember a few years ago when I had the BlackBerry phone, because with the keyboard, because I had obviously an iPhone, and I said when I work during the day, it's going to be switched off, locked away in another room. And then the BlackBerry was for family and close friends. If it's an emergency, you need me, call this phone.
Yeah.
But otherwise, don't call it during the day. I'll call you at night. We can have a good chat. But that helped when I needed to do deep periods of focus. That worked. But like, again, what you have to go through just to get some focus time. So moving on, Molly Munger, if you want to touch on one of Charlie's daughters, she touches on something brilliant. More on the topic of raising kids and what we can learn on that.
The interesting thing is what I'm about to say is so steeped in relevancy in today's both political but also like business world. If you're a fan of Peter Thiel and his interview process, for example, you're going to see a lot of what emerges here. Actually, a lot of this book is just a lot of thought leaders and tech leaders and Twitter gurus just fucking regurgitate half of the shit that's in this book. Yeah. So it just shows you that old ideas last. Lindy for the win. Daddy raised us to be skeptical, even contrarian, and that was a particularly helpful way of thinking to carry into the maelstrom of the late 60s. Over many years, sitting in the library at our house on June Street, he had told us often funny stories of people who either followed the group too blindly or lashed out too reflexively. Crazy, maladjusted, pompous, self-satisfied. We knew from his adjectives what he thought we should avoid.
Yes, and she goes on to say, on responsibility for. So that I think that what you just said is brilliant in terms of, again, on the topic of raising kids, what we can learn from Munger. As Molly Munger says, on the same topic, a recurrent theme here we're touching on responsibility for family. Molly says, when I was in college, Daddy had 7 other children to raise, worked in a seedy part of Spring Street, and owned but one company, a small grimy outfit that made motor additive. But he saw these were unhinged times. He sent me the allowance of a much richer father, keeping me in professionally ironed shirts and making me feel sharp as a bandbox. From 3,000 miles away, because I believe she had moved to New York for studies and work, from 3,000 miles away, he continued to help me keep my balance. I could go on. Suffice it to say that our father has always known what he was doing. As a parent, as in so much else, I appreciated it greatly. I still do. So, the important on stepping up on the responsibility aspect, on agency for family, I think that's brilliant from Munger, and we're seeing a theme here. From Emily Ogden, one of his daughters, but if you play password and give the clue Charlie Munger's hands, anyone will first answer books. No matter where he is, his hands are always holding open a volume, typically a Ben Franklin biography or the latest treatise on genetics. One might also answer graph paper for the buildings he's been designing. When I think of my father's hands, I also see them up on stage in front of thousands in Omaha every year. So again, you can't fake it. Charlie has lived this his whole life. He set an example to his kids, not just with the way he taught them lessons by stories at the dinner table, with agency, with holding them responsible when they effed up, but also he's always got a book in his hand. He's always working hard. He's always just... This is how, I guess, he raised a proper family, because he lived it. They learned through him.
It's interesting. The best, my personal view is the best write-up from the children is from Emily Ogden. It's a beautifully written ode to her father that's all based around his hands. Yes. Given that her husband said she had hands that look similar to his. So it's really well written. If you're going to only read one of them, read that one. It's beautiful. Correct.
And I think, as you say, like, how many more of these are we going to read before we go on to chapter 3? But he's got so many kids. What are we going to do? They all say brilliant things. Really quickly, we'll go through the last two from Barry Munger. But if he wants to offer some serious counsel to one of his children, he is more likely to couch the message in an anecdote preferably delivered in a group setting so that no one else is singled out. I think that's brilliant. And how, again, going back to his story, using stories, it's a very cliche thing, but praise in public or criticize in private. But Munger wouldn't, it seems he would not even criticize in public. I mean, he would say, you've dropped the key in the lake, go and get it. But he wouldn't really, he would just hold you responsible immediately. If he wanted to teach you a deeper lesson, he wouldn't single you out. He would teach through a story or an anecdote at the dinner table. And the last one from Philip Munger.
This one's funny.
I've got to highlight Charlie's drip.
Yeah, trust.
And I remember years ago when I first read, so look, you know this, and you and our friend circle troll me around this, but even before I read this book, I would visit Bicester Village in Oxfordshire, where back in the day where they had the Brooks Brothers store.
Bicester Village is a small town outside of Oxford.
Yes.
That people can go and buy discount clothing because he's a cheapskate.
It's outlet shopping, exactly. And as Munger says, financial prudence and never overspend your income. So I was always looking for a good bargain. So I would go to Bicester Village, but then even when I traveled to the US to see family and relatives, there's Brooks, it's the home of Brooks Brothers. I would always go and get Brooks Brothers stuff in sale, or just get a lot of Brooks Brothers stuff. And then years later, I read this and I laughed. Philip Munger says, some of my most affectionate memories of my father are of shopping for clothes at Brooks Brothers and Marks and Spencer. Marks and Spencer, the British store. Most people already know that father is not a big fashion man. He once said that he was a nonconformist enough in his behavior and opinions that it made sense to chart a very straight course in attire. His going along with the normal social customs and his sense of humor, he said, were what allowed his otherwise sometimes prickly temperament to harmonize with other people. And he moves on, he goes on to say, durability has always been a first-rate virtue in my father's view, along with ritual and tradition. He never had a desire to change his primary habits, sartorial or otherwise, once he had, like Franklin, acquired them. Point being, yeah, this is brilliant when he touches on, it's funny that it says that at Marks and Spencer, but what we now think of today's Marks and Spencer.
Marks and Spencer is still a decent brand. It's actually quite
so good. I get a few polos from them, but I digress.
All right, that's the end of the children's reviews of their father. We're getting on to chapter 3 now, the Munger approach to life, learning, and decision-making.
We start here with Munger's multiple... Okay, so this has become quite a cliche or trite thing. It's become a think boy thing now. But this is the OG of the OGs. This is the King of Kings, the original, where the term mental models comes from, right? He calls the tools he uses to conduct this review his multiple mental models. They borrow from and neatly stitch together the analytical tools, methods, and formulas from such traditional disciplines as history, psychology, physiology, mathematics, engineering, biology, physics, chemistry, statistics, economics, and so on. And this goes, again, going back to why on Rational VC, we pivoted. We want to discuss books, capture all the big ideas from the big disciplines, the Lindy ideas that we can apply to business and life. There's so much for us to learn and explore from all of the things that I just outlined. So we're just starting out, and it's amazing how, as you read this book, Munger ties so many ideas from different disciplines together in a way I've never seen before.
The other really important thing that comes from Charlie's big ideas from the big disciplines is a way to analyze and evaluate, which we'll come on to in a second. But I think that becomes super important in today's information age, where there's just an abundance of noise and not enough signal. And so it helps with determining how you go about actually finding signal in all the noise. It says, Charlie seeks to discover the universe hitched to each of his investment candidates by gaining a firm grasp on all or at least most of the relevant factors comprising both its internal and external environment. When properly collected and organized, his multiple mental models, about 100 in number he estimates, provide a context or lattice work that leads to remarkable insights as to the purpose and nature of life. This is talking about the multidisciplinary section of all the big ideas, actually being able to bring them all together and use it's not about like having a theory and a framework that you stick to and you don't move away from. Mm-hmm. It's about having flexibility in understanding where different things can build on top of a framework that you might already have, or how a framework can be broken by new information, but having the wherewithal to understand why it's important and why it works.
Exactly, and tying them together. So it says, sometimes this understanding reveals the existence of second-order, ripple, or spillover effects. Other times the factors employed combine to create enormous Lollapalooza-level results. It talks here of Charlie's, in air quotes, Charlie's big ideas from the big disciplines, what I was just talking about a few minutes ago, which is so central to a lot of what we do at Rational VC. His clarity is hard won, the product of a lifetime of studying the patterns of human behavior, business systems, and a myriad of other scientific disciplines. This is, this is basically what we have on our landing page, some of these topics. Perhaps the answer is for most people, Charlie's multidisciplinary approach is simply too hard. So, he's actually said before, Charlie, in a couple of annual meetings at Berkshire, when people ask him questions, he says, I wouldn't advise you to go down this multidisciplinary path that I did because it's too hard. Like, most of you are not interested. And he actually advises young kids who ask him for career advice to specialize. Personally, again, as much as I agree with 98 or whatever, 95, 99% of what Munger says, on that point in today's fast shifting world, I would say being more generalist is better. Maybe there's some bias there. Of course, again, being aware of the psychology of human misjudgment. But with the way the world is shifting, I think maybe being T-shaped, as they say, a bit cliche to say, but you're very deep in one area, but you also have generalist on broad in very different disciplines. So I'm not sure I agree with that one, with specializing in one thing, which Munger advises to young people in his annual meetings.
But he's advising that because he doesn't want them to go down the rabbit hole, especially if they don't necessarily have the intellect
It's
of
tough.
what he went down.
It's tough, yes.
But that's because he says Charlie counts preparation, patience, discipline, and objectivity among his most fundamental guiding principles. He will not deviate from these principles, regardless of group dynamics, emotional itches, or popular wisdom that this time around is different. I think that just puts to bed kind of a lot of what we've said.
This part is brilliant. At the 2004 Berkshire annual meeting, a young shareholder asked Buffett how to succeed in life. After Buffett shared his thoughts, Charlie chimed in, don't do cocaine, don't race trains, and avoid AIDS situations.
He's really got this thing against mistresses and sleeping around.
Yes.
And that's brilliant. It's very good of him to keep pushing that. But I think this was in the midst of the AIDS epidemic, or at least just afterwards.
This reflects both his general views on avoiding trouble in life and his particular method for avoiding missteps in investing. Charlie generally focuses first on what to avoid, that is on what not to do. I mean, I can learn a lot from that, especially in the last few years, my late 20s, early 30s. I was like finding my feet in life, and via negativa. We've talked about this before in the inserto piece. So there's the concept of always invert, which we'll come to, which is the Jacobi concept from the algebraist Jacobi that Munger leveraged and used and explains. But what not to do is more important than what to do. Go and watch our episode on Anti-Fragile. Yes.
Or the Black Swan, where we discuss this.
Yes.
In our previous inserto episodes.
Exactly. And so especially if you're a younger listener and you want to know how to, I think this notion of, as you said, inversion, of avoiding mistakes. So you say, what are the mistakes I want to avoid? Okay. What would a bad life look like? Here's what a bad life would look like. You list all the bad things. And you're like, all right, just avoid the list. So I think that's a much better thing than maybe what I went through the last few years of like finding my feet and making a ton of mistakes. That method is much better, which I've employed more as of late.
And also what it talks about is the risk of ruin, right? So we've spoken about risk of ruin before with a lot of the inserto. Like there's so much overlap between inserto...
Rationalists unite.
Rationalists unite. There's a lot of overlap between Taleb and Munger's views. But this point around avoidance of... Like if you... And the children spoke about it as well. If you... are ruined, there's no way back. So you have to, that's your number one priority, is ensure you don't get ruined. Like his kids, like going to school and actually having the funds to continue schooling.
Yes.
Like that's the responsibility that you have to provide to your family around risk of ruin avoidance.
Precisely. Within this pursuit of rationality and simplicity, he is careful to avoid what he calls physics envy, the common human craving to reduce enormously complex systems, such as those in economics, to one-size-fits-all Newtonian formulas. Instead, he faithfully honors Albert Einstein's admonition: a scientific theory should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. Charlie recognizes that even among the most competent and motivated of people, decisions are not always made on a purely rational basis. For this reason, he considers the psychological factors of human misjudgment some of the most important mental models that can be applied to an investment opportunity. which we're going to get onto. Obviously, the last talk 11 of the book, is a psychology of human misjudgment, his central talk or essay, if you will, which he actually contributed to for this book. He actually sat down and worked on that as well with Kaufman. I've got here, before we move on, I hand it over to you. My sticky note here literally says, elite, once again, multidisciplinary. It says here, it's talking about the methods, I guess, that Munger was using. They were developed by Charlie from scratch to satisfy his own exacting requirements. They probably deserve a title of their own, something like quickly eliminate the big universe of what not to do, follow up with a fluent multidisciplinary attack on what remains, then act decisively when and only when the right circumstances appear. It is worth the effort to develop and adhere to such an approach. Is it? Is it worth? Charlie seems to think so. It's kind of fun to sit there and outthink people who are way smarter than you are because you've trained yourself to be more objective and more multidisciplinary. Furthermore, there is a lot of money in it, as I can testify from my own personal experience.
He then moves on to his evaluation process, which is probably the most... So one of the things that I took away the most, apart from Talk 11 in this book, he specifically splits his investment evaluation process into 3 different buckets. As he says, we have 3 baskets for investing: yes, no, and too tough to understand. This explains why, for example, Berkshire Hathaway never invested in Apple, I think up until 2016, because the concept of tech was too complicated and it was outside of their circle of competence. And he says, to identify potential yes candidates, Charlie looks for an easy-to-understand, dominant business franchise that can sustain itself and thrive in all market environments. That's why, for example, he loves Coca-Cola. Many investor favorites, such as pharmaceuticals and technology, for example, go straight to the too tough to understand bucket. Heavily promoted deals and IPOs earn immediate no's. Those that do survive this first winnowing are subjected to the screens and filters of Charlie's mental models approach. The process is intense and Darwinian, but also efficient. Charlie detests placer mining, the process of sifting through piles of sands for specks of gold. So this goes back to this whole concept of signal versus noise.
Yes.
Because he's created this evaluation framework and he immediately can separate between good, bad, and too tough to understand. Yep. He's able to like jump to conclusions much faster and with more conviction than anybody else.
So on the investing principles checklist, which wraps up really this chapter 3, we've touched on all the multidisciplinary approach to investing, to life, etc. Now, it's funny, before I get onto this investing principles checklist of Munger...
I know it's funny,
but...
What do you think makes a good project manager?
What I find interesting is, here is a checklist. Now, some of the great intellectuals, like, that's prescriptive. I think Taleb, correct me if I'm wrong, somewhere in one of the Inserto books we were studying, he literally said, I'm not a fan of checklists for when giving advice, but in one or two exceptions, he said, if you were to follow something. So there is no right answer. It seems Charlie here, for Charlie's own words of wisdom on the value and importance of checklists, see Talk 5. So Charlie placed actually importance. He liked checklists. Maybe not prescriptive, he never said that, but checklists which helped him to gather lots of different ideas in a concise way. And so the investing principles checklist he has here, I think is brilliant. It doesn't mean that if you read these, 3-4 pages, you're going to become Munger. So manage your expectations, but I think it's a brilliant checklist where there's actually a lot that can be applied to life and to other areas, not just to investing. So the checklist consists of a few different things. The first one being risk. All investment evaluations should begin by measuring risk, especially reputational. So we're not going to go through because this risk subsection has 5 bullet points, and so do all the other factors of this checklist. That's going to be too long. We do advise, we're going to throw this up on the screen actually if you're viewing. If you're listening, the link for the Stripe Press site for the free version of Poor Charlie's Almanac is below as a reminder, so you can follow along for the full checklist. Go and read it yourself.
It's on, just FYI, it's page 64, 65, and 66.
Yes, at the end of chapter 3 wrapping up. And so on risk, one of the bullet points, Munger says, avoid big mistakes Shun permanent capital loss. This goes back to Nassim Taleb, which is avoid the risk of ruin, avoid things that wipe you out.
The other one that's quite interesting is his discussion around analytical rigor, where he says use the scientific method and effective checklists. The reason he says this, and also the reason why he has these different checklists, and I think he's a proponent of a little bit of prescription, is because he doesn't want to make mistakes on his own. He wants to learn from other people's mistakes. And he talks about this over and over again in the book. But he talks about the fact of using analytical rigor to determine value apart from price. Like, what are you actually testing here? And then use the inversion technique to ensure that you're always thinking about what it could look like in the future, but what it could also look like in the past.
Exactly. He says under the analytic rigor, consider the totality of risk and effect. Look always at potential second order and high level impacts. Second time that's come up so far in the book. Think forward and backward. Invert, always invert. Other points apart from risk and analytic rigor are independence. Only in fairy tales are emperors told they are naked, referring to independence. Another point is preparation. And so under preparation, he said, the only way to win is to work, and hope to have a few insights.
Work.
Under intellectual humility, acknowledging what you don't know is the dawning of wisdom. Any more that you like here?
Yeah, and then the final one, I think that's good. Like, all of them are good, and all of them you could spend an hour talking about. But the one is change. Live with change and accept unremovable complexity. This is, I think, something that humans just really struggle with. Adaptation to the true nature of the world around you. Don't expect it to adapt to you. When you raise people in a environment where they get everything they want and they don't have hardship and they don't work and they don't learn the value of acquisition through hard work, what ends up happening is that they expect everything on their plate all the time. And that is problematic, because what you don't do is to continually challenge yourself and learn how to adapt with change.
Precisely. And the last one is focus. It says, keep things simple and remember what you set out to do.
Don't use your phone.
So keeping things simple, at Rational VC, we were doing so many things. We were doing, other than the podcast, we were...
Wait. The reason we were doing so many things is because Cyrus would message me at like 2 a.m. one day. Oh, I had this idea. This is sick. Look at what this person is doing. Let's do this. And it's like, hold on a second. Focus on the main thing.
Looking for blue oceans, but as Iman says, focus on the one thing, focus on the main thing. And so we decided to strip back so many, like our investing at rational.fund. For the next few years, our investing activities have temporarily reduced. The one thing is the pod. The essays are a byproduct of the pod, but the foundation of everything is the podcast. We're building a Lindy timeless media publishing company here. So
we stripped it back more than a stripper in Las Vegas, man.
Charlie's most basic guiding principles, his fundamental philosophy of life: preparation, discipline, patience, decisiveness. Each attribute is in turn lost without the other, but together they form the dynamic critical mass for a cascading of positive effects, for which Munger is famous, the Lollapalooza. And I think we're going to get into Lollapalooza a lot in the talk 11, but that's basically what it is. Before we get into it, a teaser of the official definition. Each attribute is in turn lost without the other, but together, it's when the multiple factors come together they form the dynamic critical mass for a cascading of positive effects, for which Munger is famous, and the term the Lollapalooza, that's what it refers to. It's kind of like a flywheel effect when you bring multiple factors together.
Yes, it builds on his eighth wonder of the world, which is compounding, which is where this concept comes from. Okay, look, wrapping up, he gets into the 11 talks after these first 3 chapters, right? So the next chapter is the 11 talks, and these are all like amalgamation of, as you said at the beginning of the podcast, different talks, writings, whatever that he's given over time. If you're going to read this book, you have to approach it like how you would approach... not like most books. What we would recommend is you read these talks independent of each other and then read the book as a whole. The reason is, like, you should be able to pick up this book, look at read a specific talk and take something away from it. Go away, flaneur, go and enjoy life, and come back and read a different part of the book, read a different talk, because you pick up very different things every time you look at this, and your experiences in life inform what you learn from the book over time very differently as well. So having said that, should we jump into chapter 4 and the different talks he gives?
Yes, so chapter 4 being the last, and you can say the main chapter. Chapter 4 consists of the chunk of the book. It's 11 talks, 11 different talks Munger has given over the years. As I said at the start of the episode, some of the talks, the ideas start overlapping. we want to try and avoid that as much as possible. So we're going to cover all of the talks that have new ideas or ideas that don't overlap, or his key ideas basically. So I think his main talk, which he actually spent time writing and refining for, is the final talk, The Psychology of Human Misjudgment. So we're going to spend a lot of time on that. But before we get to that, there are a few other talks and ideas from his other talks that we'd like to touch on. The first one, talk 1, being the Harvard School commencement speech. Note, this is not Harvard University, but Harvard Prep School. This occasion was the graduation of Philip Munger, the last of the 5 Munger family sons to matriculate at this prep school, originally an all-boys institution and now the coeducational school called Harvard Westlake. So some of the key ideas on this talk at Harvard School are around happiness, misery, etc. Munger says here, there was only one such speech given by Johnny Carson, specifying Carson's prescriptions for guaranteed misery in life. I therefore decided to repeat Carson's speech, but in expanded form with some added prescriptions of my own. What Carson said was that he couldn't tell the graduating class how to be happy, but he could tell them from personal experience how to guarantee misery. Carson's prescriptions for sure misery included: number 1, ingesting chemicals in an effort to alter mood or perception; number 2, envy; number 3, resentment. And of course, going back to invert, always invert, this is the list Munger is saying, telling these kids graduating, this is the things that you should avoid. And it's a recurrent theme here. He always talks about envy, resentment, self-pity, doing drugs or alcohol, ingesting chemicals. I mean, not part of this list, but he even talks on many occasions around heavy ideologies. It's interesting how Nassim Taleb, on prior episodes we've spoken of, Nassim talks about the positive aspects of religion, not in a literalist sense, but I guess in a intergenerational risk management sense. And Munger is completely just anti-religion. He's kind of spoken about it before, paraphrasing, but he says it's like a form of brainwashing, or you're identifying with their ideology, and it's not a rational way of thinking.
The one around resentment is quite interesting as well, because he discusses Benjamin Disraeli, the British Prime Minister, who would actually not take action on the basis of someone he hated or in vengeance. But typically what he would do is he'd note down the names of these people and put them in a drawer. So at least he would have thought about, at least he would have compartmentalized that issue for himself to ensure that he's not going to be taking his enemies down with some sort of dangerous resentment invoked.
Exactly. And then he moves on after that Disraeli paragraph. He says, so much for Carson's 3 prescriptions. Here are 4 more prescriptions from Munger. First, be unreliable. Second, for misery, is to learn everything you possibly can from your own experience, minimizing what you learn vicariously from the good and bad experiences of others, living and dead. This prescription is a sure-shot producer of misery and second-rate achievement. The other aspect of avoiding vicarious wisdom is the rule of not learning from the best work done before yours. The prescription is to become as non-educated as you reasonably can. Again, this is inversion. This is the list of things to avoid. My third prescription to you for misery is to go down and stay down when you get your first, second, and third severe reverse in the battle of life. Epictetus said, "Here lies Epictetus, a slave, maimed in body, the ultimate in poverty and favored by the gods. My final prescription to you for a life of fuzzy thinking and infelicity is to ignore a story they told me when I was very young about a rustic who said, 'I wish I knew where I was going to die, and then I'd never go there.'" And of course, with all of this, Munger then wraps up with the great algebraist Jacobi, as you said, Iman, talks about invert, always invert. So here is the list of things Munger is saying you need to avoid if you want to avoid misery. Rather than saying, let's seek happiness, he's saying, here are the things that will make you miserable, a life of misery, and avoid the list. If you minimize objectivity, you ignore not only a lesson from Darwin, but also one from Einstein. Einstein said that his successful theories came from curiosity, concentration, perseverance, and self-criticism. And by self-criticism, he meant the testing and destruction of his own well-loved ideas.
I think that brings to the end that talk 1. The second talk 2, a lesson on elementary worldly wisdom as it relates to investment management and business, given at the University of Southern California Marshall School of Business in April 1994. The first place I want to start with this talk is on worldly wisdom, where he said,
Beautiful. Rationalvc.com.
this is literally, again, something our brand is built on. What is elementary worldly wisdom? Well, the first rule is that you can't really know anything if you just remember isolated facts and try and bang them back. If the facts don't hang together on a lattice work of theory, you don't have them in a usable form. You've got to have models in your head. And you've got to array your experience, both vicarious and direct, going back to what we discussed in the previous talk, on this lattice work of models. You may have noticed students who try to remember and pound back what is remembered. Well, they fail in school and they fail in life. You've got to hang experience on lattice work of models in your head. So I disagree with him where he says they fail in school. I think the schooling system is completely designed for memorization and learning through repetition. It's not designed on what you would term thinking through this lattice work on mental model approach, i.e. first principles thinking. It doesn't teach you that. This is why he loves physics, for example, and he talks about in the rest of the book, is because it teaches you basic fundamental principles that you can then develop further learning on. This whole point about mental models. And he then goes on to say, what are the models? Well, the first rule is that you've got to have multiple models, because if you have just one or two that you're using, the nature of human psychology is such that you'll torture reality so it fits in your models, or at least you'll think it does. This is completely the concept from Taleb around the Procrustean bed and Platonic theory.
And this is a very important line which will come up in his Psychology of Human Misjudgment. As the old saying goes, to the man with only a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And of course, here we're touching on the models have to come from multiple disciplines, because all the wisdom of the world is not to be found in one little academic department. That's why poetry professors, by and large, are so unwise in a worldly sense. They don't have enough models in their heads. So you've got to have models across a fair array of disciplines. You may say, my God, this is already getting way too tough. But fortunately, it isn't that tough, because 80 or 90 important models will carry about 90% of the freight in making you a worldly wise person. So it is not easy, but that's what we're doing at rationalvc.com for the next decade or few decades, through the studies of all these wonderful books and knowledge that is out there for us to use and leverage.
So the other thing that he talks about is, of those models that he describes, which models are the most reliable? Well, obviously the models that come from hard science and engineering are the most reliable models on this earth. And engineering quality control, at least the guts of it that matters to you and me and people who are not professional engineers, is very, very much based on the elementary mathematics of Fermat and Pascal. It costs so much and you get so much less likelihood of it breaking if you spend this much. It's all elementary high school mathematics. And an elaboration of that is what W. Edwards Deming brought to Japan for all that quality control stuff. He's basically saying that of the models that you appreciate and use the most, understand that mathematical and fundamental physical theory is probably going to be the most important, because it gives you the foundation that you then build on.
He also goes on to say the most useful and practical part of psychology, which I personally think can be taught to any intelligent person in a week, is ungodly important. And nobody taught it to me, by the way. I had to learn it later in life, one piece at a time. The elementary part of psychology, the psychology of misjudgment, as I call it, a terribly important thing to learn. There are about 20 little principles and they interact, so it gets slightly complicated. But the guts of it is unbelievably important. And obviously, you stick around and we're going to get to talk 11, the psychology of human misjudgment, where he goes further into that. Continuing in this talk, he talks about the advantages of scale and social proof. He says the advantage of scale are also ungodly important, which scale here in our sense, in the sense of the modern day world, I would say, we've spoken about code, capital, media, leverage multipliers. These are things that facilitate scale. Munger is a huge fan. He obviously didn't put it in these modern terms that we speak of, but scale is scale. In his day, it would have been capital and labor specifically. Let's go through a list, albeit an incomplete one, of possible advantages of scale. Some come from simple geometry. If you're building a great circular tank, obviously, as you build it bigger, the amount of steel you use in the surface goes up with the square, and the cubic volume goes up with the cube. So as you increase the dimensions, you can hold a lot more volume per unit area of steel. That is so important. That, again, going through how Munger uses stories or examples or analogy or whatever in any way he wants to get a point across, he uses one of those. It's just magnificent. And then he goes, there are all kinds of things like that where the simple geometry, the simple reality gives you an advantage of scale. For example, you can get advantages of scale from TV advertising. And he says in the early days, there were only like 3 or 4 channels. The big companies that had a lot of cash reserves, they would get on TV advertising. And that's pretty much the only place where adverts were around in those days. It would build a lot of trust. And they keep coming up again and again on the screen. And he speaks of, touching on advantage of scale, the social proof element, one of my favorite topics that I'm always talking to you about in our friend circle. Like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? Like, what's this logic behind it? Social proof. And I sound like a broken record at this point, but it comes from Robert Cialdini, which we're going to touch on this wonderful man's name and work shortly in this book. Advantages of scale, what you might call an informational advantage. Another advantage of scale comes from psychology. Psychologists use the term social proof. We are all influenced subconsciously and to some extent consciously by what we see others do and approve. Linking it also with mimesis, the work of René Girard, further popularized and studied by Luke Burgess in the book Wanting. He is a past guest on the show, but we're going to bring him on again when we discuss his book in detail this time. Therefore, if everybody's buying something, we think it's better. We don't like it to be the one guy who's out of step. Again, some of this is at a subconscious level and some of it isn't. Sometimes we consciously and rationally think, gee, I don't know much about this. They know more than I do. Therefore, why shouldn't I follow them? The social proof phenomenon, which comes right out of psychology, gives huge advantages of scale. So going to online business and podcasting model, that's somewhere we can apply the advantages of scale and social proof. When we started Rational VC podcast, it was selfishly to speak to, when we used to do the interview format anyway, which we no longer do, it was selfishly meet some people from Silicon Valley we wanted to get to know. The social proof of how did we get the first guest we actually ever had on Fun Fact, let's take a side note. The first guest we ever brought on the show was Matteo Franceschetti, who is the CEO and founder of 8 Sleep, the huge mattress company, the mattress technology company that kind of changes temperature, tracks your sleep, etc. Matteo back then was still, he was big. He had raised 70 million from Peter Thiel Founders Fund, etc., etc.
Yeah, he's killing it.
He's killing it now, even more so, but back then he was already killing it. And we were like, if I find the old tweet or throwing up on screen of how I just basically tweeted at him to say, come on the pod. But it was something along the lines of, you obviously compliment him, just humans love to be complimented. But then I said something around the like, I threw in all the elements of social proof that our podcast had at that point. We only had 5 episodes, which was Iman and I just riffing about VC, sitting on some chairs in the living room, not too dissimilar from now. But Naval Ravikant liked one of those because it was about rolling funds. And I was like, how could I use that to... So I was like, by the way, Matteo, Naval's liked our podcast. We've had co-signs by Naval and others or something along those lines. Matteo was like, wow, if his tweet reply is still there, I'll throw it up. He was like, wow, thanks for thinking of me. I'd love to come on. Boom, in the bag. And then how do we get the next guest? I was like, Matteo has been on the podcast from A Sleep and Naval has co-signed. Boom, next. And then it's just a trickle effect.
Cascade effect. Yeah.
And then we started doing deals. We've done co-investments with Founders Fund and others. So social proof is paramount. It will be a disservice. It would be injustice to not touch on Robert Cialdini's name shortly. We will come back to that. I think Robert Cialdini deserves his own segment and his own episode actually on Rational VC at some point soon. But that was crucial, the social proof phenomenon.
I mean, the interesting thing about social proof is that it can both be the creator of scale and you can build scale, but it can also be a downfall of scale. I think he goes on for the rest of this part to talk about the issues that emerge from bureaucratic systems which are massively scaled. He says the constant curse of scale is that it leads to big dumb bureaucracy, which of course reaches its highest and worst form in government where the incentives are really awful. This builds on this concept of show me the incentives, I'll show you the money, which is actually that if the incentives are poorly designed, like he suggests they are in government, actually decentralized units are removed, everything becomes centralized, you remove agency, and therefore the skill that comes from agency and individuality is completely taken away, and these big institutions tend to fail. And he even says in like literally, but bureaucracy is terrible. And as things get very powerful and very big, you can get some really dysfunctional behavior. So I think it's useful to understand the value of scale and the value of social proof in getting you to scale, but also understand the downsides.
Exactly.
CBS provides an interesting example of another rule of psychology named Pavlovian association. You might know the name from Pavlov's dogs. If people tell you what you really don't want to hear, what's unpleasant, there's an almost automatic reaction of antipathy. You have to train yourself out of it. It isn't foredestined that you have to be this way, but you will tend to be this way if you don't think about it. What is he getting at here?
Well, I mean, he's wrapped it up himself. He says, so life is an everlasting battle between those two forces to get these advantages of scale on one side and a tendency to get a lot like the US Department of Agriculture on the other side, where they just sit around and so forth. I don't know exactly what they do. However, I do know that they do very little useful work.
Shots fired.
Shots fired, absolutely.
So we touched on earlier about the concept of circle of competence and how and why they don't invest in certain companies like Apple up until 2016 with Berkshire Hathaway. He then talks about, again, this is a very, very powerful idea. Every person is going to have a circle of competence, and it's going to be very hard to enlarge that circle. If I had to make my living as a musician, I can't even think of a level low enough to describe where I would be sorted out to if music were the measuring standard of the civilization. So you have to figure out what your own aptitudes are. If you play games where other people have the aptitudes and you don't, you're going to lose. And that's as close to certain as any prediction you can make. You have to figure out where you've got an edge, and you've got to play within your own circle of competence.
This is super interesting. This is like combining this advice plus Cal Newport's advice from So Good They Can't Ignore You. At this point, an OG book of Cal Newport's, which he talks about. It's interesting. I wouldn't just follow this Munger advice alone. I would combine it with Cal Newport's advice. And Cal, what he gets at is what he means by be so good they can't ignore you is forget this notion of follow your passion. It's all BS. Of course, you need to have some base level of interest and strength in the topic, but really, you just become so good. Steve Martin used to say, be so good they can't ignore you. And after years of getting very good at something, passion stems from becoming very good and aptitude. And then that actually allows you to have more autonomy, set the terms around your kind of employment or whatever you're doing. And so passion stems from being well versed in the subject as well. So I think combining that with what Munger is saying, which is know what your aptitudes are, but at the same time, a lot of people will be like, I don't know what my aptitudes are. I might not be interested in really anything, because that's what a lot of young people say nowadays. They just want to be YouTubers, streamers, whatever. I mean, what would you advise there? I mean, my thing is combine this, which is a base level of what Munger's saying, with Cal Newport's advice. How do you see this?
I disagree. I think passion is more important than people give it credit for. Like you can grind away for 50 years in a profession and become an absolute expert in it, but the reality is you still prefer, playing golf with your friends on the weekend. So what I'm saying is, like, it's not bad that you spent 50 years in that thing, but sure, the passion that you might have had for a sport with being around your friends could have been something that you devised your life around that actually would have brought you more joy, right? So there's this break between what is actually what you're looking for from a professional perspective versus actually a life design perspective, which is why this book is so useful, because it gives you an overview of how to think about multidisciplinary life development and creation, as opposed to just your professional piece. The other thing I'd say is it builds on this whole Naval thing that we've spoken about before around figure out what you're good at and then leverage that. It's a lot easier to swim with the tide than against the tide. And he talks about, he talks about this a lot in this specific talk. But if you are 17, 18, 19 years old and you go into a specific industry, you've had very little time to develop an understanding of why you went into that industry. It's a lot of a lot of doctors go into medicine because they think it's a stable career, which it is, and it's great. But a lot of them will go into that profession and realize that actually they're nowhere near as good as the people that are currently operating in that environment. You've also got the example of Jeff Bezos in Amazon, where he talks about learning mathematics at university and then going to, working super hard to figure out one really complex thing. And then they weren't able to figure it out. He goes to one of the people in the class that was an absolute genius in maths, and he just figured it out in 1 second.
Yep.
And that guy's actually, I think, a current professor, I think either in Harvard or Stanford or something like that. So he obviously went the right way. But Bezos talks about how that helped him think about setting up Amazon, because he realized he needs to swim with the tide. So I kind of disagree with Cal Newport when it comes to that. But also, like, I understand why he's saying what he's saying, because you've got to try a million things to actually understand what you are bad at.
Correct. But also to expand on what you're saying, which I actually agree mostly with, what Cal Newport is saying is, okay, well, combining with other ideas, end of the day, bills need to be paid and you need to earn money. Going out and there playing golf with your friends is not going to pay the bills when you need it paid. But Cal says, okay, it's going to suck, but the first few years, first 4 or 5 years, you become really good. And then, for example, on the 5th year, you can set up your own small family law practice where you're not going to earn as much as being a magic circle lawyer, big shot corporate lawyer. You're going to earn enough, but you're going to have autonomy and independence. And so you can be on the golf course with your friend playing golf, and you have golfing clients. You have more autonomy and freedom over your schedule. That's the kind of thing he's talking about. And then maybe eventually bills do need to get paid. And then in the long term, you can find your way or find your path to, maybe that leads to, in the long run, you're then buying a minority in some golf business or something, and then you're getting closer and closer to your passion, but still your craft you're so good at is allowed that autonomy and freedom. And then combining that with, obviously, as the base, what Munger says, which I totally agree with, you need to have some aptitude, some, like Naval says, you need to have some strength, some aptitude and interest. But really, a lot of kids who are lost these days are like, I'm not interested in anything. There are some things that you're interested in and you're still good at. And no, it doesn't always have to be streaming and YouTube, etc. Because as Taleb says, that's operating in Extremistan. The tail end. What you should be doing is take a safe route and then barbell your career, which is you have your day job, but then you're tinkering or doing your side projects or what you find really fun in the evenings and weekends. And eventually when that takes off through doing a portfolio of small bets, one of them will eventually take off, hopefully. And then you can focus on that. So that's probably combining all of those figures together. That's kind of the answer we probably get at.
The next concept in this specific talk that he talks about and is really interesting is this point around the importance of freedom. He says, most investment managers are in a game where the clients expect them to know a lot about a lot of things. We didn't have any clients who could fire us at Berkshire Hathaway, so we didn't have to be governed by any such construct. And when we came to this notion of finding a mispriced bet and loading up when we were very confident that we were right, so we're way less diversified. And I think our system is miles better.
I think the importance of freedom that you touch on here and autonomy, which a lot of people in modern day investment management, venture, generally just most businesses, they get lost in this whole thing of having to answer to so many people. Taleb has a brilliant quote along the lines of, avoiding slavery doesn't mean you just avoid being an employee. You also need to avoid becoming a master, because it's still another form of slavery. You're answering still to people. This life of rushing around, always running around, commuting to your job, not having any time for yourself to sit and think in solitude, you have no freedom. And as Naval says, when you have no freedom, you have no free time to yourself. You are not able to develop good judgment or decision making, which really is the foundation of what a lot of what Munger talks about in this book is good judgment, good decision making. What Taleb talks about, getting clear thinking or a clear mind. These things that are priceless, how is it obtained? First, one needs to focus on obtaining freedom or autonomy to some degree that allows the time to pursue such thinking or such mental models, if you will, that allows you to be happier, more peaceful and progress.
I love it because it's very much it's very much a reflection of exactly why we set up Rational VC in the first place, and this points around Extremistan that you raised. Look, he goes on and talks about a whole bunch of other things in this talk, and we don't want to stick on this talk specifically, but at the end of talk 2, what he does is he revisits the talk and he reviews it in 2006. And he gives a little discussion around some of the specifics around why he did it, And then he goes into a Q&A. So there's an updated version of the talk as well. Do you want to touch on any of these things?
What difference does it make if the path from start to finish is a little more bumpy or a little different than everybody else's, so long as it's still going to work out well in the end? So what if there's a little extra volatility? In investment management today, everybody wants not only to win, but to have the path never diverge from very much from a standard path except on the upside. Well, that is very artificial, crazy construct. That is really hobbling yourself. Do you know what that reminds me of? It's basically, I've written here, deep tech investing proposition, which we're doing more of, as Taleb talks about in Skin in the Game. Rationality means survival. It means also serving the ecosystem and the avoidance of systemic ruin, which I think deep tech, life sciences, defense technology, etc., in the world of tech investing, for example, which we do on the side, that's what that is. And what Munger is also getting at here, you combine these ideas together, is really cool. You know, deep tech investing is extremely risky. It's very, very high in capex, cash burning heavily. A lot of them will fail. Hardware is very difficult. A lot of deep technology is very difficult. But in early stage investing, in our world, in the VC world, this is where, I mean, now it's become kind of a mimetic thing maybe to say you're doing deep tech investing. But if you are doing it from early on, hat tip, kudos, because this is diverging from your typical fucking 5,000th VC SaaS investor in D2C, what sort of buzzwords? D2C, I don't even know. I don't even know. There's all these buzzwords they throw together and they look for the certain LTV and CACs and all this horse shit. Anyway, diverging and deep tech, brilliant. I really like that part. It resonated. Let's go to the Q&A at the end, because here we've written important, some of Charlie's life advice. Take us away.
So So what this reminds me of is the end of Skin in the Game with Taleb's book, where he says, if young people ask me for advice, I always tell them a few things, and one of those was start a business, etc. It's very reflective of, at the end of this conversation, what Charlie says. He says, the question is, what should a young person look for in a career? And he says, I have 3 basic rules. Don't sell anything you wouldn't buy yourself. Don't work for anyone you don't respect and admire. Work only with people you enjoy. And then the follow-up question is, what overall life advice do you have for young people? He says, have low expectations, have a sense of humor, and surround yourself with the love of friends and family. This might, at first glance, be like, okay, fine, these are all like really high-level, simple things. But when you take it into the context of the rest of the book and, you know, talking about via negativa and inverting, and you know how to think about life design and multidisciplinary thinking and creating mental models, etc. All of this actually makes a lot of sense. If you abide by these things, which I would guess 99% of people are not, I think you design a much better life for yourself.
And he wraps that up, what you just said. He says, above all, live with change and adapt to it. If the world didn't change, I'd still have a 12 handicap. This whole change topic, again, tying it with Taleb's embracing randomness. I actually had a tweet here, which I'll throw up. I said, Charlie Munger says the first rule of a happy life is low expectations. I want that, but, you know, me personally, Cyrus speaking, I struggle to have low expectations. And then a random dude on Reddit gave the best answer. Yet again, we come back to the topic of embracing randomness. And what this dude on Reddit said, if you're listening, we'll throw the link in the show notes to my tweet. If you're watching, it's on the screen. This guy on Reddit said, this is a great life lesson tying in Munger and Taleb. He says, I went through the same thing on my journey to plain old life. Here is a truth from someone who likely is far older than you are. Life is going to throw you curveballs. You do not know if random chance or some genetic misdeal will leave you with a chronic illness later in life. You have no control over the romantic partner that catches your eye, and the most unlikely one may indeed be the one or the last one. Random people will do the damnedest things around you, and you will endure the fallout and many times prosper from the unexpected opportunity. Plan all you want. Failure to plan isn't good either, but planning will not make it so. Think of your life as navigating a river you've never been on before. You may have a destination in mind. You may even have a map and an idea of where the currents are, but you do not control the weather. On embracing randomness, you have limited control over the workmanship of the boat, and there may be new hazards under the water that no one else has charted. You move on and you adjust as necessary, and you'll get closer to your destination. Even if you don't get there, you still should enjoy the trip. Having an unchangeable idea of who you are and how you'll get to your stated destination is what sunk the Titanic. Don't be the Titanic. And obviously this is a random dude on Reddit who's talking about embracing randomness. And I tweeted about it. I said, Charlie Munger says the first rule of happy life is low expectations. I want that, but I struggle to. And this random dude on Reddit gives the best answer. Yet again, Taleb liked this tweet of mine actually. Yet again, we come back to the topic of embracing randomness, which is Munger's getting at this too. I think as we get older, maybe hopefully this will get easier. But I know that in our 20s, especially me speaking, even in my early 30s, it's having high expectations, which causes misery to some extent, or just internal friction and stress. So Munger, extremely wise words. That's page 119. I highly recommend it if anyone wants a summary of that Q&A with Charlie, advice to young people.
Then we go on to talk 3, a lesson on elementary worldly wisdom as it relates to investment management and business, revisited. So it's the same talk, but it's revisited differently. This was given in April 19th, 1996 at Stanford Law School. It was given to the students of Professor William Leisure, who was the Nancy and Charles Munger Professor of Business at Stanford University Law School. Why am I saying that? And I'm not saying it for the other talks, is because he has been a provider of funds to this school, and therefore that's why he is named after the school's law school.
Yes. Again, slowly, even in this talk, we start seeing some overlapping ideas with prior talks. So we'll go to the parts which we think are, personally anyway, we think are important. He touches on in this talk the dangers of ideology. I touched on this earlier, right? We're going to expand on it a little bit here. Charlie says, but if the junior professor and I are right, how has a genius like Chomsky made an obvious misjudgment? The answer is quite clear to me. Chomsky is passionately ideological. He is an extreme egalitarian leftist who happens to be a genius. And he's so smart that he realized that if he concedes this particular Darwinian point, the implications threaten his leftist ideology. So he naturally has his conclusion affected by his ideological bias. And that gets into another lesson in worldly wisdom. If ideology can screw up the head of Chomsky, imagine what it does to people like you and me. Ideology does some strange things and distorts cognition terribly. If you get a lot of heavy ideology young and then you start expressing it, you are really locking your brain into a very unfortunate pattern, and you're going to distort your general cognition. That is brilliant. That is one of the, I think, most important parts of the book, in my view.
And the reason he thinks like this is not because he's done a lot of reading, and of course it is because he's done a lot of reading and learned a lot of stuff, but he actually talks about his childhood. He says, I learned the same lesson in a different way. My father hated ideology. Therefore, all I had to do was imitate my father and thereby stay on what I regard as the right path. He actually talks about Ralph Nader, which is in some of Taleb's books and
Skin in the Game.
Skin in the Game, exactly. And he talks about how people like Bob Dornan on the right and Ralph Nader on the left have gone a little daft because they're extreme examples of what ideology will do to you. I think you see this a lot in the podcast bro space as well, is where people get, in order to grow a podcast, in order to become popular and actually have your ideas shared, you have to double down on a specific niche. What ends up happening is when you go down a niche and start holding the position of that niche, very quickly you can lose objectivity without even realizing it, and you become entrenched in your position.
Yes.
And any alternative position you take will piss off your own audience, and therefore completely give you the risk of ruin around what you've built. So what he's saying here is don't become so ideologically obsessed such that you lose that objectivity. This is also why he hates religion, really. He thinks that people lose their objectivity.
And that's why on this pod, we say we're basically just figuring it out. We don't have the answers. Join us on this journey of figuring it out through the studies of these texts. He goes on to say on this ideology, wrapping up this ideology point, he says, you should be very wary of heavy ideology. You can have heavy ideology in favor of accuracy, diligence, and objectivity, but a heavy ideology that makes you absolutely sure that the minimum wage should be raised or that it shouldn't, and it's kind of a holy construct where you know you're right, makes you a bit nuts. Being totally sure on issues like that with a strong, violent ideology, in my opinion, turns you into a lousy thinker. So beware of ideology-based mental misfunctions. Brilliant.
So after the dangers of ideology, he kind of builds on some questions that are asked to him in the talk. And quite interestingly, he talks about how they have him and Warren have a flexible approach to thinking where they can change their own conclusions.
Self-awareness.
Self-awareness, strong ideas, loosely held, as you love to say. He says, "It's not at all clear to me that Warren and I would be that good at doing what Andy Grove does. We don't have special competence in that field. We are fairly good at relating to brilliant people we love, but we have defects. For example, some regard me as an absent-minded and opinionated. I might be a mess at Intel. However, both Warren and I are very good at changing our own prior conclusions. We work at developing that facility because without it, disaster often comes." They have a complete and utter flexibility and objectivity in learning, and are flexible and have enough humility to realize when they are wrong and change their conclusion.
And he says, touching on what we said earlier around picking careers for young people, each of you will have to figure out where your talents lie, and you'll have to use your advantages. But if you try to succeed in what you're worst at, you're going to have a very lousy career, which is really wraps up what we said earlier. It's not saying you have to have extreme passion about something, but have some aptitude, have some strengths, and then build on that. Then become so good that they can't ignore you. On mistakes, he says, "I'm just saying that you can learn to make fewer mistakes than other people and how to fix your mistakes faster when you do make them. But there's no way that you can live an adequate life without making many mistakes. In fact, one trick in life is to get so you can handle mistakes. Failure to handle psychological denial is a common way for people to go broke. You've made an enormous commitment to something. You've poured effort and money in. And the more you put in, the more the whole consistency principle makes you think, now it has to work. If I can put in just a little more, then it'll work." Obviously, sunk cost fallacy, but absolutely brilliant from here on mistakes.
He actually gets a question which is building on this. It says, the person who asked this brilliant question, I bet it got a whole bunch of laughs when it got asked. "Do you ever gamble Las Vegas style?" And he says, "I won't bet $100 against house odds between now and the grave. I don't do that. Why should I? I will gamble recreationally with my pals, and I'll occasionally play a much better bridge player like Bob Hammam, who might be the best card player in the world. But I know I'm paying for the fun of playing with him. That's recreational. As for gambling with simple mechanical house odds against me, why in the world would I ever want to do that, particularly given how I detest the manipulative culture of legalized gambling?" So he goes on to hate on gambling, and he says, "I do, however, like the manly art of wagering, so to speak, and I like the light social gambling among friends, but I do not like the professional gambling milieu." So he's basically saying that there's nothing wrong with gambling as long as you're doing it recreationally and not risking the essentially risk of ruin.
Yes, brilliant. I mean, on that topic, tonight I'll see you at the Ojak Kvasha Open Fire Grill, and we'll have a game of poker with the lads, or you and Tehran Tony can have a game of backgammon, and I'll bet on that. He also, one of the questions he's asked in this talk, and I've written online cults, LOL, because it relates to modern day as well. He says, "Well, if you're like me, it's kind of fun for it to be a little complicated. If you want it totally easy and totally laid out, maybe you should join some cult that claims to provide all the answers. I don't think that's a good way to go." That is basically so much of the BS that we see in modern day Instagram, YouTube adverts of buy my dropshipping course, buy my Forex course, buy this course. I have the answers. Like, people just looking for a guru or someone who has the answers. And for as long as time, there was always California gold rush or whatever, people selling the shovels and finding cults. We live in a day, I mean, this has always been around, this notion, but in day to day, this day and age, online cults have just reached a level of absurdity.
If you ever see an advert come up around, and these adverts, some of them are brilliant at catching your attention, come up around, "We can make you a millionaire in X amount of time. All you need to do is X, Y, and Z." 99.9999% of the time, actually 100% of the time, 100%. It's a fraud. It's a fraud flinging you bullshit.
And what they're doing, it's a very good point. You said a lot of them are actually good adverts. A lot of them, what they're doing without actually knowing, they're applying Robert Cialdini's teachings without being aware of it.
Actually, this is why I say 99.99. Actually, you can learn a lot from the adverts themselves about persuasion and how to get people to lock on to, in like 10 seconds, less than 10 seconds, lock into what you're saying.
Precisely. And we did mention, we'll come on to Robert Cialdini.
Cialdini.
We will in the final talk where Munger praises Cialdini and actually gave him shares of Berkshire. as a thank you for his work in the Influence book.
So the final thing in this talk that he talks about is he gets a question about, is there an ideology component to what you would do? Is there something that you're irrationally passionate about? And he says, yes, I'm passionate about wisdom. I'm passionate about accuracy and some kind of curiosity. Perhaps I have some streak of generosity in my nature and a desire to serve values that transcend my brief life. But maybe I'm here just to show off. Who knows? I believe in the discipline of mastering the best that other people have ever figured out. I don't believe in just sitting down and trying to dream it all up yourself. Nobody is that smart.
Rationalvc.com. I think our website is probably just going to be quotes of Munger.
You could literally take any statement made in this book. Just do this. Just do this. If you're watching, I'm just flicking through the page. Oh, stop here. Page 222. Possessing a strong balance sheet and productive culture. Oh, great. Yeah, add it to the website.
But yeah, it's brilliant. That's where Shane Parrish of Farnham Street got his quote from. It's from Munger. Mastering the best of what other people have figured out. It's brilliant. It's why we read these books. I don't believe in just sitting down and trying to dream it all up yourself. Nobody's that smart. Again, the Munger himself being that smart and saying all of this, it goes to show, and so many people these days claim to have the answers. So talk 4 is an informal talk given by Munger called Practical Thoughts About Practical Thoughts as a question. And this is actually, I think, one of the most important talks. It actually requires rereading a few times to understand it, as the preface suggests. But it's more of a case study where Munger uses his multidisciplinary approach applied to Coca-Cola. So he takes the example of, imagine you're pitching Coca-Cola in the late 1800s and you're using a multidisciplinary approach to thinking to say why it's going to be a success. We cannot really do it any justice. If we can't read the whole thing for you, which is 10 plus pages. You can go and read it yourself. We're only going to spend a couple of minutes on this talk just to take out some snippets to give you a glimpse into how brilliantly he applies some of his mental models and approach to thinking to a Coca-Cola case study. Munger says, in a long career, I have assimilated various ultra-simple general notions that I find helpful in solving problems. 5 of these helpful notions I will now describe. The first is that it is usually best to simplify problems by deciding big no-brainer questions first.
The second helpful notion mimics Galileo's conclusion that scientific reality is often revealed only by math, as if math was the language of God.
The third helpful notion is that it is not enough to think problems through forward. You must also think in reverse. Again, Carl Jacobi so often said, invert, always invert.
The fourth helpful notion is that the best and most practical wisdom is elementary academic wisdom, but there is one extremely important qualification: you must think in a multidisciplinary manner.
The fifth helpful notion is that really big effects, Lollapalooza effects, will often come only from large combinations of factors. It is now time to present my practical problem, and here is the problem. So he basically says it is 1884 in Atlanta. You were brought along with 20 others like you before a rich and eccentric Atlanta citizen named Glotz. Both you and Glotz share 2 characteristics. First, you routinely use in problem solving the 5 helpful notions and that Munger's just listed. And second, you know all the elementary ideas in all the basic college courses as taught in 1996. So the big ideas from all the big disciplines. However, all discoverers and all examples demonstrating these elementary ideas come from dates before 1884. Neither you nor Glotz knows anything about everything that has happened after 1884. So it's kind of going back in time, pretend you're in 1884. Glotz is offering to invest $2 million in 1884 dollars, yet take only half the equity. Charlie then says, here is my solution, my pitch to Glotz, using only the helpful notions and what every bright college sophomore should know.
He goes through all of the 5 major elements that he spoke about earlier and then applies them to how you would think about the notion of investing in Coca-Cola to Glotz.
And 1884.
In 1884 without any further knowledge. And actually he comes to what conclusion does he come to?
Comes to a brilliant conclusion where basically I'll give a couple of highlights. Again, please go and reread this yourself several times. It's free online, but I'll take some highlights which still will not do any justice. He says, first, we're never going to create something worth $2 trillion by selling some generic beverage. Therefore, we must take your name, Coca-Cola, into a strong legally protected trademark. Second, We can start in Atlanta, but then grow to the US, then grow worldwide. We will use numerical fluency to ascertain what our target implies. We can guess reasonably that by 2034, about 150 years after this pitch, there will be about 8 billion beverage consumers in the world. On average, each of these consumers will be more prosperous in real terms than the average consumer of the late 1800s. And then he goes on to psychology. We can see from the introductory course in psychology that in essence, we are going into the business of creating and maintaining conditioned reflexes. Conditioned reflexes, well, the psychology text gives two answers. One, by operant conditioning, and two, by classical conditioning, often called Pavlovian conditioning to honor the great Russian scientist. And since we want to lollapalooza the result, we must use both conditioning techniques and all we can invent to enhance effects from each technique. For operant conditioning rewards, here there are only a few categories we'll find practical.
4 categories. Number 1, food value in calories or other inputs. Number 2, flavor, texture, and aroma acting as stimuli to consumption under neural pre-programming of man through Darwinian natural selection. Number 3, stimulus, as by sugar or caffeine. And number 4, cooling effect, when man is too hot, or warming effect, when man is too cool.
So this is brilliant because Coca-Cola basically ticks all of those boxes.
Yes, sir.
It has sugar, it has caffeine, the stimuli. It has a cooling effect when man is too hot.
Yeah, nice ice cold Coca-Cola goes down a treat.
The flavor, texture, and aroma acts as a stimuli to consumption under neural pre-programming. So, you pick it up, you're like, he goes on to say in this talk, he says, it's going to look like an exotic and expensive beverage. The texture, the flavor, the color, the exotic sounding name Coca-Cola. It looks pretty much like wine instead of sugared water. We're going to in this pitch to Glotz in 1884. Hey Glotz, we're also going to carbonate the water, making our product seem like champagne or some other expensive beverage, while also making its flavor better and imitation harder to arrange for competing products. For there is the powerful saying, monkey see, monkey do, aspect of human nature that psychologists often call social proof. We can see now, Glotz, so in this pitch to Glotz, we can see now, Glotz, that by combining 1, much Pavlovian conditioning, 2, powerful social proof effects, and 3, a wonderful tasting, energy-giving, stimulating, and desirably cold beverage that causes much operant conditioning, we are going to get cells that speed up for a long time by reason of the huge mixture of factors that we have chosen. Therefore, we are going to start something like an autocatalytic reaction in chemistry, precisely the sort of multifactor triggered Lollapalooza effect we need.
Imagine being in the audience when he gives this speech.
In the pitch, yeah, I'd say you're deranged. I'm not investing. You're deranged. It's like who? It's too good.
Yeah, no, like the pitch. Okay, fine, but imagine sitting here listening to him go through all of this excruciating detail, and I can't remember what was this. It was like it was
a
just a case study.
Talk. It was a secret talk, an informal talk he's giving to a group of people.
Yeah, he says this talk was delivered in 1996 to a group that has policy of not publicizing its programs.
Yes.
So he sat there going to detail in this case secret study. Society about fucking Glotz and the creation of Coca-Cola.
In this made-up pitch in 1884. Brilliant.
But it's a brilliant example of like all of his mental models and how they feed in together in a very, very, very strong case, which is obviously his biggest investment, I suppose.
Exactly. He continues in this pitch in 1884, pitching Coca-Cola to Glotz in 1884. He says, the logistics and the distribution strategy of our business will be simple. There are only 2 practical ways to sell our beverage. 1, as syrup to fountains and restaurants. Number 2, as a complete carbonated water product in containers. Wanting Lollapalooza results, we will naturally do it both ways. And wanting huge Pavlovian and social proof effects, we will always spend on advertising and sales promotion per serving. Over 40% of the fountain price for syrup needed to make the serving. Brilliant. Goes on to say we'll make a big hoopla over our secrecy, which will enhance Pavlovian effects.
Hoopla.
And then, this is actually brilliant. I actually have a sticky note here relating to the Rational VC brand, because for a while we were thinking about, our episodes since pivoting, we discussed Lindy Books. Do we need to change the name Rational VC? It's not really relevant anymore. And we decided to keep the name. And I've written here, brilliant, on not changing the Rational name. On page 172, next page, he says, the best way to avoid envy, as recognized by Aristotle, is to plainly deserve the success we get. We will be fanatic about product quality of product presentation, and reasonableness of prices, considering the harmless pleasure we will provide. 4th, after our trademark flavor dominates our new market, we must avoid making any huge and sudden change in our flavor. Even if a new flavor performs better in blind taste tests, changing to that new flavor would be a foolish thing to do. This follows because under such conditions, our old flavor will be so entrenched in consumer preference by psychological effects that a big flavor change would do us little good. It would do immense harm by triggering in consumers the standard deprival super reaction syndrome that makes takeaways so hard to get in any type of negotiation and helps make most gamblers so irrational, and goes on and on. I was like, just brilliant.
Yeah, so you're basically saying don't make any sudden changes, which is what we decided not to do. Because of the power of
Companding, social proof, everything he says here, the psychology of consumers' taste, how it's entrenched in consumer preference by psychological effects, yada, yada, yada.
And then he goes on to say, this brings me at last to the main purpose of my talk. Large educational implications exist. If my answer to Glotz's problem is roughly right, and if you make one more assumption I believe true, that most PhD educators, even psychology professors and business school deans would not have given the same simple answer I did. And if I am right in these two ways, this would indicate that our civilization now keeps in place a great many educators who can't satisfactorily explain Coca-Cola even in retrospect, and even after watching it closely all their lives. This is not a satisfactory state of affairs.
Such extreme ignorance in both the high reaches of academia and the high reaches of business is a Lollapalooza effect of a negative sort, demonstrating grave defects in academia. Because the bad effect is a Lollapalooza, we should expect to find intertwined multiple academic causes. I suspect at least two such causes. First, academic psychology, while it is admirable and useful, it goes on. So this, we said we're only going to spend 2 minutes on this talk and go quickly. It was impossible. It got us too excited. It is, again, just reread this 10 times. It's a brilliant talk where he ties it all together.
He says, thus my failure as a communicator was even more extreme than the cognitive failure I was trying to explain. Why? The best explanation I now think is that I displayed gross folly as an amateur teacher. I attempted too much. I have always avoided all people who want to converse at length about the meaning of meaning. Yet I chose as my title Practical Thought about Practical Thought. This was a start into tough territory. Then I worked out a long, complex interplay of 5 generalized, powerful problem-solving tricks with basic ideas from a great many disciplines. I particularly included psychology, about which I wanted to demonstrate that there is much lamentable ignorance even among highly educated people, some of whom teach psychology. My demonstration naturally relied on correct psychology as part of my would-be demonstration. This was logically sound, but if psychological ignorance is widespread, why would most of my hearers recognize that my version of psychology was correct? Thus, for most hearers, I did the rough equivalent of trying to explain some hard-to-comprehend ideas by simply defining those ideas as equivalent to themselves. He's basically saying that, basically building on exactly what you just said there around the value that comes from psychology and the value that comes from those who don't even understand where psychology is coming from in the context of explaining success.
Exactly. So Charlie here, revisiting that talk, as you said, he's kind of saying, he's showing humility, but he's saying, I was an amateur teacher here. There's better ways of doing it. And he wraps up, readers, if they wish, can correct somewhat for the teaching defects that I have stubbornly retained. That is, they can reread this talk after mastering the final talk. So we keep mentioning talk 11, the psychology of human misjudgment. We're going to get to that. Once you also read that with us and separately, once you've read that, then you come back to this talk 4, practical thought about practical thought. If they are willing to endure this ordeal, I predict that at least some of them will find the result worth the effort. So again, nothing worthwhile is achieved easily. So that wraps up talk 4. I think now the next few talks, lots of paramount ideas in there, lots of important ideas in there, but there is a good degree of overlap. And again, one episode is not going to do this book any justice, but we do need to keep it within the probably 3-4 hour mark, and at that point, if it gets any longer, you can just listen to the audio book. But of course, we're adding our own perspectives too. We're going to skip the next few talks because it's mostly advice to, let's say, law students graduating law school. He's criticizing academia, he's talking about 2003 financial scandal, and so on and so forth. I think we're going to basically, the rest of this episode is going to focus on, we're going to quickly touch on talk 9 and talk 10. And then we're going to get into the psychology of human misjudgment, the final talk, talk 11. So talk 9 is about academic economics. He praises the good things about econ, which is actually, Taleb criticizes econ a lot more than Munger does.
Yeah, he does.
But Munger praises econ, but then he goes into the criticisms and he says academic economics needs improvements. Each criticism kind of has its own section within the talk, and we have a list here. So
as you say, in this section, he basically gives, I think, 9. He says, I think I've got 9 objections. So I'll rattle through the 9, and then we can, touch on them briefly, but he gives a view of them in talk 11 anyway. So the first one is fatal unconnectedness, leading to man with a hammer syndrome, often causing overweighting of what can be counted. This is finding no signal in noise.
Yes.
The second is failure to follow the fundamental full attribution ethos of hard science. The third is physics envy. The fourth is too much emphasis on macroeconomics. The fifth is too little synthesis on economics. Number 6 is extreme and counterproductive psychological ignorance. Number 7, too little attention to second and high order effects. Where have we heard that before? We've heard it loads of places before.
It's coming up, yeah.
Not enough attention to the concept of embezzlement. And number 9, not enough attention to virtue and vice effects. Are there any of those that you really, really loved?
I mean, usually when Munger keeps repeating something, he's placing emphasis on it. And I would say too little attention to second and higher order effects.
Yeah.
It's actually something I've been saying a lot myself recently when I'm like, the Taleb talks about this too, the unknown implications in a complex system of the effects one action or one thing could have that we don't think about, or most people don't think about, it's insane. And we're trying to learn how do we spot the second order and high order effects of some event or some action taking, or some decision. Day to day, we make lots of decisions from small to big and important. It's paramount, but also especially in economics, where you've got policymakers or people who are deciding the fate of the economy without any understanding of the second or high order effects, as Munger says. But they are all crucial. They are all extremely important. I think going through each one in too much detail may kind of digress from the point of this podcast. We've also touched on economics in Taleb's Inserto episodes, but as a list, I think you've summarized it exceptionally well. And I don't know if there's anything else you want to touch on before we move on to talk 10.
Let's move on to talk 10.
Let's do it. Talk 10 is at the USC Gold School of Law commencement address in May 2007, University of Southern California, USC. Again, a lot of what he says in this talk is overlapping or repetition with prior talks, because Munger keeps it simple. He has all these brilliant ideas, and when you have an idea that you've been working on for many decades and that you've learned through experience and study, you're not necessarily going to change them overnight unless you have good reason to do so. So a lot of his ideas are cemented. They're kind of his life philosophies and foundational teachings. So they're repeated a lot. But with that said, a couple of things we're going to go into.
A really good part of this specific talk is when he goes back to the concepts of envy, resentment, some of the stuff we picked up earlier. He says, generally speaking, envy, resentment, revenge, and self-pity are disastrous modes of thought. Self-pity can get pretty close to paranoia. Paranoia is one of the very hardest things to reverse. You do not want to drift into self-pity. I had a friend who carried a thick stack of linen-based cards. When somebody would make a comment that reflected self-pity, he would slowly and portentously pull out his huge stack of cards, take the top one, and hand it to the person. The card said, "Your story has touched my heart. Never had I heard of anyone with as many misfortunes as you."
And he says, well, you can say that's waggery, but I suggest it can be mental hygiene. Every time you find you're drifting into self-pity, whatever the cause, even if your child is dying of cancer, we'll get onto that, even if your child is dying of cancer, self-pity is not going to help Just give yourself one of my friend's cards. Self-pity is always counterproductive. It's the wrong way to think, and when you avoid it, you get a great advantage over everybody else, or almost everybody else, because self-pity is a standard response, and you can train yourself out of it. This is brilliant. There's a story that everyone knows at this point of Munger when he was 29, and I believe his young son, his son was 9 years old, Teddy.
He was young.
He had leukemia. He basically died of cancer. But when his son Teddy was sick in hospitals, Munger would weep. He would walk the streets of the neighborhood crying to himself. And later, at the age of and he was getting divorced. His son was dying. And later, I think in his early 50s, I think he went blind in one eye. He had an eye cataract and endless other difficulties that he's faced. But it's amazing how these are things that would destroy most people.
Yeah.
Yet Munger not only kept going, but only kept growing in life in every regard. And so he's lived by this, and it's very difficult to attain. I think this is kind of ingrained in most humans, this kind of self-pity thing, especially in the Western world with comfort and lack of, losing sight of gratitude. It's very difficult.
The thing that really popped out is where he says it's really hard to reverse, because what it does is it puts you in a state of negativity that is self-reinforcing, so you can't get out of it. So he just says completely avoid it in the first place. In the context of his son, like, you're allowed to mourn, and he talks about how he's mourning, how difficult life is. But the point is not to get trapped into thinking life cannot get any better, or about thinking, that your life is fucked as a result of anything.
Yeah, my point is, exactly. So the mourning, of course, the mourning and grieving, it's actually healthy to do that. My point is, after all these events, his son passing away and divorcing his wife after having multiple children together, after this, he didn't stay down.
Yeah, trust.
He didn't have self-pity to stay down, which I'd kind of understand why most people would stay down after that, or losing sight.
You've seen it, yeah. You see people completely lose their lives when
and he started to learn Braille after he lost his sight in one eye, because he said, if I go blind in the other eye, I want to keep reading. It's insane. The level of, I don't know,
it's a combination of agency. He just has extreme agency that comes from intelligence.
And this is, I think, one reason is, it's a bit cliche and trite now to say with all of those books Ryan Holiday has published or popularized, but the topic of Stoicism, which Taleb also touches on, Rationalists Unite, if we go to page 279, he touches on the Stoics.
Yeah, and he says, another thing to cope with is that life is very likely to provide terrible blows, unfair blows. Some people recover and others don't. There, I think the attitude of Epictetus helps guide one to the right reaction. Side note, by the way, everybody talks about Epictetus, so we need to do a podcast episode on that. He thought that every mischance in life, however bad, created an opportunity to behave well. He believed every mischance provided an opportunity to learn something useful, and one's duty was not to become immersed in self-pity, but to utilize each terrible blow in a constructive fashion. His ideas were very sound, influencing the best of the Roman emperors, Marcus Aurelius, and many others over many centuries. And you may remember the epitaph that Epictetus made for himself. Here lies Epictetus, a slave, maimed in body, the ultimate in poverty, and favored by the gods, which you said earlier, and he keeps repeating.
Yes. And when we talk about how he's overcome a lot of this, you touched on agency, many other factors, but also he's actually practiced Stoicism, which he's practiced Stoicism, but not in a heartless way of I'm a robot with no emotions. He's practiced it in a way where you can see the care and love he has for his family, the responsibilities he takes on, the agency, but at the same time, he doesn't drown himself in self-pity. All the things he's gone through, you become blind in one eye, I'm going to pick up Braille. He goes on to say, well, that's the way Epictetus is now remembered, favored by the gods. He was favored because he became wise, became manly, and instructed others, both in his own time and over following centuries. I have another idea to emphasize in a brief account. My grandfather Munger was the only federal judge in his city for nearly 40 years. If you recall, earlier on in the episode, we touched on grandfather Munger, who bailed out a bank of his Charlie Munger's uncle Tom. My grandfather Munger was the only federal judge in his city for nearly 40 years. I admired him. I'm his namesake, and I'm Confucian enough that even now as I speak, I'm thinking, well, Judge Munger would be pleased to have me here. All these years after my grandfather is dead, I conceive myself as duty-bound to carry the torch for my grandfather's values. One such value was prudence as the servant of duty. Grandfather Munger was a federal judge at a time when there were no pensions for widows of federal judges. So if he didn't save from his income, my grandmother would become a destitute widow. And besides, net worth would enable him to serve others better. Being the kind of man he was, he underspent his income all his life and left his widow in comfortable circumstances. This is brilliant. I know we say we don't want to read a lot from the book, but I'm wrapping this up. This is too good. But that was not all that his prudence enabled. Along the way, in the 30s, my uncle's tiny bank failed and couldn't reopen without help. My grandfather saved the bank by exchanging over a third of his good assets for horrible bank assets. I've always remembered the event. It reminds me of A.E. Housman's little poem that went something like this. The thoughts of others were light and fleeting, of lovers meeting, or luck or fame. Mine were of trouble, and mine was steady, and I was ready when trouble came. This is just brilliant.
Yeah, it talks to... Actually, there's a very lawyer way of thinking about life, by the way, because it's like this concept of being ready for ruin and always being ready to see that what could go wrong. So you set yourself up so things don't go wrong.
Yeah. So we are now at the final part of the book, but a big chunk of the book. I would say if there were only... I mean, you should read the whole book, but if they said you have to read just one part of the book, it really gathers a lot of Munger's key ideas together. He actually spent time refining this. This was from a talk or from a few talks, but Munger refined it specifically for this book. His world famous, The Psychology of Human Misjudgment, the key central talk in this book. And we are finally here.
Yeah, it does say at the bottom of the initial page for this that this is from 2005, which is selections from 3 of Charlie's talks combined into one talk never made after revisions by Charlie in 2005 that included considerable new material. So this is the magnus opus, if you will, of all of his work coming into one.
So before we get into there's 25 biases that Munger speaks of in this Psychology of Human Misjudgment. There are obviously a few pages where he gives an intro of this talk. I've got a few highlights I want to touch on. It says, this generalized evolution-based theory structure was inadequate to enable me to cope properly with the cognition I encountered. I was soon surrounded by much extreme irrationality displayed in patterns and subpatterns. So surrounded, I could see that I was not going to cope as well as I wished with life unless I could acquire a better theory structure on which to hang my observations and experiences. And he goes on, here we finally are, sir, as we've mentioned several times, the book Influence by Robert Cialdini. Munger says, academic psychology has some very important merits alongside its defects, which obviously he's been critical of during this book. Munger was so influenced by Cialdini, he said, I immediately sent copies of Cialdini's book to all of my children. I also gave Cialdini a share of Berkshire stock Class A to thank him for what he had done for me and the public. Insane. We've said we're going to do an episode on Influence by Cialdini. It is a very important book. It is the most gifted book by Munger. Man's often wrong but generally useful psychological tendencies are quite numerous and quite different. The natural consequence of this profusion of tendencies is the grand general principle of social psychology. Cognition is ordinarily situation dependent, so that different situations often cause different conclusions, even when the same person is thinking in the same general subject area. I will next simply number and list psychology-based tendencies that, while generally useful, often mislead. And here are the tendencies. Here are the 25 biases, the tendencies of the psychology of human misjudgment. So, before we get into the list of 25, he has placed insane emphasis on the first one with regard to just the length, the amount of time. A lot of them he covers on just half a page each. The first one, the reward and punishment super response tendency, obviously referring to incentives, is a key one. Going into some of the highlights of this first one, which we want to place some emphasis on as he does. Never a year passes, but I get some surprise that pushes a little further my appreciation of incentive superpower. One of my favorite cases about the power of incentives is the Federal Express case. So FedEx had this thing back in the day where they had to deliver parcels overnight, but they realized they were not really delivering them overnight because the employees were paid by the hour. And so after much trial and error, they just said, why don't we just pay them by the shift. We pay them at the end of the night once the plane is loaded. And lo and behold, next day deliveries, it was happening after many years of struggle, of failings. The next day. So we should also heed the general lesson implicit in the injunction of Ben Franklin in Poor Richard's Almanac. If you would persuade, appeal to interest and not to reason. This maxim is a wide guide to a great and simple precaution in life. Never, ever think about something else when you should be thinking about the power of incentive.
So then he goes on to discuss something called the man with a hammer tendency, where he says, a man with a hammer tendency does not exempt smart people like Blanchard and Skinner, referring to what he was mentioning earlier, and it won't exempt you if you don't watch out. I'll return to man with a hammer tendency at various times in this talk because fortunately there are effective antidotes that reduce the ravages of what pretty much ruined the personal reputation of the brilliant Skinner. What he's getting at here is that there are catch-all solutions that people want to apply, general theories that people want to apply to problems that they face. Whereas in reality, it's not a hammer that solves the issue. It's actually a screwdriver to multiple different types of screws that you might have.
Yes.
So you have to have this in your arsenal of ways of solving issues.
And I have here a sticky note that says, LOL consultants. Now that's an extreme case, but in lesser strength, the cognitive drift of that surgeon is present in every profession and every human being, and it causes perfectly terrible behavior. Consider the presentations of brokers selling commercial real estate and businesses. I have never seen one that I thought was even within hailing distance of objective truth. In my long life, I have never seen a management consultant's report that didn't end with the same advice. This problem needs more management consulting services.
You got to make your money somehow. He specifically says that this is related to... So let's just go back to the beginning of what incentives are actually getting at here. He's talking about the fact that you have to understand incentives are the most powerful driver of outcomes, right? Show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome, I'll show you the money. Recognize the power of incentives and that both incentives and disincentives can completely drive and change rational quote-unquote behavior. So you have to make sure that you get the incentives right, particularly if you're in a position of management. The reason management consulting is quite interesting is because you're actually giving advice to management. And if your incentive is to ensure that more advice is given because you make more money out of it, by design, the incentives are wrong.
And a lot of this goes back to touching in with asymmetry from Skin in the Game, Taleb's book, a few episodes ago we did. Munger here says, the general antidotes here are 1. Especially fear professional advice when it is especially good for the advisor. This is Skin in the Game. Number 2, learn and use the basic elements of your advisor's trade as you deal with your advisor. And number 3, double check, disbelieve, or replace much of what you're told to the degree that seems appropriate after objective thought. If you go back to the episode 18 of this podcast, I believe it was a Peter Kaufman and Munger, a multidisciplinary approach to thinking episode that I did. Kaufman talks about this in his episode as well. He was talking about some incentive-based structure that he learned from Munger and how you can't expect employees to care unless they have skin in the game. So Kaufman is talking about his equity-based incentive structure and giving employees shares or equity in the company and skin in the game, where you no longer deal with these issues that Munger is speaking of and the asymmetry that we spoke of in Skin in the Game.
So this is all building on this concept of incentive-caused bias that can essentially lead to bad behavior, which you mentioned, and cognitive drift, as he calls it, because you're not necessarily aware that you have this bias. He says another generalized consequence of incentive-caused bias is that man tends to gain all human systems, often displaying great ingenuity in wrongly serving himself at the expense of others. Anti-gaming features, therefore, constitute a huge and necessary part of almost all system design. Whatever you design has to be created in a way that limits the incentive for bad behavior. You have to figure out what those incentives could be, and that's fucking hard because you have to scope the known unknowns, and also you have to have a contingency for unknown unknowns as well, which is a lot harder said than done. What you end up with is things like unions, for example, on the employee side, which we didn't touch on, but those are things that can emerge if there's not enough contingency built within the design. He also mentions something called the Granny's Rule. He says, Granny's Rule, to be specific, is the requirement that children eat their carrots before they get dessert. The business version requires that executives force themselves daily to first do their unpleasant and necessary tasks before rewarding themselves by proceeding to their pleasant tasks.
Yeah, given reward superpower, this practice is wise and sound. Moreover, the rule can also be used in the non-business parts of life. The emphasis on daily use of this practice is not accidental. The consultants well know after the teaching of Skinner that prompt rewards works best.
You gotta give rewards as soon as you can't. Delayed rewards don't work because the value isn't there to the individual to stay around. The final thing just to note is when we talk about incentives, what he means is predominantly money in this case, but not just money, because that might apply to business, but it also applies to other things. So people change their behavior and thinking for sex, for friendship, companionship, status, which we've spoken about,
yes.
and loads of other things that aren't money related. So don't just look at this in the concept of money.
Yes. Okay, so that was the main and first tendency. We're not going to spend as much time as we have going through the rest because firstly, you should read it. Secondly, then you could just read the book. I think before we do in the future, revisiting this book and rereading it, we need to do another separate episode in the future just on the psychology of human misjudgment, because every time I read it, every time we go through it, you realize the sheer importance of it, and it's something that needs to be constantly revisited.
Agreed.
We'll go through a few of them here, especially our favorite ones or what we deem to be key ones. They're all key, to be honest, but we'll fire off some of them and then give a quick couple of sentences explanation for what they are. So, for example, if we want to kick off with the second one,
should we do 2 and 3 together at the same time, because they're just opposites of each other?
A few of them are opposites, yes. So, if you want to take us away,
yeah. So, liking and loving tendencies is number 2, and disliking and hating tendencies is number 3. For the liking and loving one, number 2, it's basically that we're ignoring faults in people that we like and love, right? And you just basically become rose tinted in the view of individuals on the basis of whether you like or love them. And then number 3 is the opposite. You ignore the virtues that come from people we dislike and hate. So you only see the bad stuff. I think he says politics is the art of marshalling hatreds. Politics is a brilliant example of this, number 3, where you just ignore the virtues that a politician or a group that you don't like has.
Yeah, this can cause really irrational distortions, which lead to impossible mediations between opponents because the facts, air quotes, do not overlap. So.
Like this concept is the essential problem that we have with social media and politics today. It's just literally people just don't shut up because they can't hear each other.
Pretty much, yeah. The next one is the doubt avoidance tendency. So we tend to avoid doubt by manufacturing certainty. Our brains are programmed with a tendency to quickly remove doubt by reaching some decision. I guess this is sloppy or lazy way of thinking. And this makes sense as it would be counterproductive to be deliberate when a predator is near, It is typically triggered by some combination of puzzlement and stress, so threat. One solution is to force delay before decision making. It's logical that some leaps of religious faith are greatly boosted by this tendency. You have to reconcile many different religious beliefs. I think the very important decisions of life, especially, should be delaying decision making, not delaying the decision itself, but pondering over it, going through, for example, one of many, the second order and higher order effects, as we said, and many other things to take into factor in consideration. Multi-model complex systems, one needs to delay before making a final decision on something.
Number 5 is related. So this is the opposite, which is inconsistency avoidance theory. It's basically like we avoid inconsistency because we resist change. So because our brains are wired in a way that we don't want to change, and it like conserves energy by doing so, we can apply this to how humans actually like operate and what their habits are. The tendency is that it makes it much easier to prevent a habit than to change it. So like it's basically this avoidance theory of just not trying to do the right thing because you're physically unable to do so.
Yes, I mean we tend to maintain our previous conclusions, human loyalties, reputational identity, commitments, accepted role in civilization, and this tendency causes first conclusion bias and confirmation bias. Combined with the doubt avoidance tendency we said just a few minutes ago, this tendency can create a lot of thinking errors. We get imprisoned in poor conclusions that are maintained by mental habits that are hard to break, and then of course we tend to accumulate large mental holdings of fixed conclusions and attitudes, and you can get kind of stuck down this deep spiral of, it's so strong basically that it will often prevail after one has only pretended to have some identity, habit, or conclusion.
I think the best word to describe this tendency is the status quo bias. Like you just stick with the status quo. You don't want to change. Number 6 is curiosity tendency. We tend to be curious about new things because we're mammalian in nature, and this is part of who we are. It's
pros and cons.
Yeah, it's got both good things and bad things, right? So if you're curious about something, it's going to push you to learn and push you to advance your knowledge, and it helps us like remove bad consequences by focusing on the wisdom that you can gain. But then it can also mean that you're just jumping between all different things that you're curious
lack of focus
about.
And reduced progress. The next one is the Kantian fairness tendency.
I like this one.
We tend to prioritize or expect fairness. Immanuel Kant, of course, modern man expects a lot of fairness because this is necessary for an advanced civilization to work. One example is the first come, first served bias that leads to people forming lines. Another example is how we let others merge in on highways. When someone breaks these fair sharing rules, hostility occurs. This tendency has probably contributed to the abolition of slavery, women's rights and gay rights, etc. So the Kantian fairness tendency has been a good thing for society.
There's a negative side to it, obviously, as well.
Sure, second order effects.
Yeah. So like if you expect always things to be fair when they're not fair and you're not ready for change, it's going to fuck you up. So you need to be anti-fragile. Yes. Check out our podcast on that. Number 8 is envy and jealousy tendency. This is a very important one.
Before you get into this one, Munger always speaks of, there are a few key ideas. He always speaks of avoiding envy and resentment, avoiding self-pity, not overspending your income, compounding. So please, this is a key one he always mentions. Take this away.
Yeah, I mean, we've mentioned it already a few times, but it's basically you want what others have, right? So like it's not, even if you have what you wanted originally, it's never enough. This is the way that humans work. We've touched on this multiple times.
Taleb touches on the hedonic treadmill adaptation, whatever.
And Warren Buffett has a quote. He says, "It is not greed that drives the world, but envy." This is the whole concept of nemesis. And it's basically like we've evolved to like want what is scarce because of how we got to where we are today as a civilization and individual humans. It's hardwired in us. It's funny, he talks about people go crazy when a peer gets paid a multiple of the average pay for a position. Like if people get a lot of money.
Yeah.
And also it's the very interesting thing about envy and jealousy is that it transcends time. Yes. Every single generation has its own version of envy. And that's why you see it in every single religious book. Like it will talk about how envy is like bad and you should avoid it.
Number 9, reciprocation tendency. We tend to reciprocate favors and disfavors. A benefit of this tendency is that it facilitates group cooperation for the benefit of its members.
Number 10 is influence from mere association tendency. So this is where we like give value to things just based on association. Like if something is higher priced, you immediately subconsciously believe that it's higher quality. If you smoke beautiful cohibas and Cuban cigars like this Romeo and Julieta number 2, which is a decent cigar, but actually I prefer the Trinidad's here, which Munger will dislike because he dislikes smoking.
Munger and Tyler would not like, but you know.
Tyler, maybe.
But as Loza of Salta Cigars says, he's asked a few surgeons, very prominent surgeons in London, the dangers of smoking cigars. I'll quickly wrap this up. I know it's it's a side note. And it ties into a lot of what we discussed. So the surgeon was thinking of second order and high order effects. The surgeon said, yes, but the stress is the biggest killer, the surgeon said. Stress is the biggest killer.
So if this reverts stress.
So if for some people, and Loza said for him personally, it rates a 9 out of 10 in lowering stress, sitting around friends like his friend Hammond, and they love it. He says, we're so busy running around daily. When you sit down an hour with your friend, you have a cigar, the lowering of stress, net, it's probably, in his words, it's probably a positive for him compared to the stress accumulation that could cause issues, and it would lead to him meeting a surgeon. So that's a side note.
So this is basically what it's saying is although it may appear that smoking is like this amazing thing that will make you appear cool,
Yes.
and that that association with coolness that comes from this not giving a fuck by smoking is actually, on the flip side, actually quite a good thing to do, because you're sitting down, you're chilling, you're just pausing and contemplating life. But the concept is actually used a lot in marketing, right? Which is this point around endorsement. So if someone you respect endorses something, because you associate the person with good things,
Yes.
you immediately endorse
insane.
you basically are ready to take the
It's a
product.
classic influencer model, but yeah.
Always tell us the bad news promptly. It is only the good news that can wait, which is a Berkshire induction that he talks about in this section.
So that was the influence from mere association tendency. Continuing on the notes here, the 11th tendency, simple pain-avoiding psychological denial. We tend to avoid painful situations by automatically denying reality. The reality is too painful to bear, so we distort it. For example, an addict who sees themselves as respectable while they are spiraling out of control.
This one's sad. Like, you see this a lot,
sad, yeah.
which is kind of fucked up. But the number 12 is excessive self-regard tendency. I love this one because this is every Iranian uncle. We tend to overvalue ourselves, our decisions, our people, and our possessions. I am a Persian man of great heritage from the great Persian Empire. Cyrus.
I was literally about to say, I'm even guilty of this. And trying to exercise some self-awareness.
The downfall of Iran can partially be explained by this specific tendency in my general view. But it's the endowment effect, right? We have what we already own greater than how we would value it if we did not own it. This point around having versus not having.
I guess, like drug addicts say, the first step is acknowledging your faults. So.
Self-awareness is like one of the major themes of this book, I suppose.
Yes.
But he says try to face two simple facts. He says fixable but unfixed bad performance is bad character and tends to create more of itself, causing more damage.
And of course, to what you just said, the best antidote is to force yourself to be more objective when you're thinking about yourself, your family, friends, your property, and the value of your past and future activity. Pride is not bad if it is truly justifiable. The most useful form of pride is a justified pride in being trustworthy.
Yes.
I mean, in the last, when he says the best antidote is to force yourself to be more objective.
Number 13 is over-optimism. So
he says we tend to believe the future
will be better than today.
And make decisions based on this. So Demosthenes said, what a man wishes, that also will he believe. One solution is to train yourself to apply math and probability to decision making. But of course, we're not saying be mechanical robots. That's not the only tool you use in your arsenal in decision making.
Number 14 is deprival These are brilliant names. Deprival superreaction tendency. That's basically how we react to irrational intensity to a small loss, even if it's a threatened loss, not an actual loss of anything that's of value to you, right? That could be your potential loss of an opportunity, of like land or
possession,
whatever. Yeah, anything really. It's basically why, for example, you'll get groups of people be really scared of a potential new entrant into the market.
Incumbents, for example, how they respond to new tech companies, new innovations, new things on the block. The next one, probably one of our favorites, social proof tendency. We tend to think and act as we see others around us thinking and acting. Monkey see, monkey do, which I've already touched on from his hypothetical Coca-Cola pitch to Glotz in 1884. This gets triggered most often in the presence of confusion or stress, and particularly when both exist. It works for good behavior, for example, opening doors for others, and bad behavior. We've seen writing across many decades in history. When that happens, it's usually it's a minority that kickstart that. And then the rest follow because social proof, like, oh, so-and-so is writing. Why will I not join in? And without even catching themselves, thinking, oh, this is the wrong action, they join in.
He specifically says, because both bad and good behavior are made contagious by social proof tendency, it is highly important that human societies, number one, stop any bad behavior before it spreads, and number two, foster and display all good behavior.
Yes. Number 16 tendency is contrast misreaction tendency, which is, we tend to overreact to high contrast and underreact to low contrast. Examples: a bad second wife might be good compared to a really, really bad first wife, or a bad husband might be great compared to a really, really bad father. A good overpriced house might be great compared to a really bad overpriced house. So price anchoring, basically, or the classic story of the frog being placed in boiling water. It will jump out. But if you place the frog in cold water and slowly heat it up, it will cook nicely. Small expenses adding up over time. Benjamin Franklin said, beware of little expenses. A small leak will sink a great ship.
No, I know what you're going to say. That's it.
Rubbing my hands. If you're watching, we'll throw up the meme of the man in the yellow suit behind a tree rubbing his hands.
Professional NFL player.
This is brilliant. This is a Persian saying. You and I, when we went to Farsi Persian school as kids every Saturday in London, I don't know which year it was, year 4, year 5, one of the years anyway, the teacher was reading something out and telling us this kind of thing, which I'll say in Farsi and then you can do the honors. قطره قطره جمع گردد وانگهی دریا شود. I obviously say it with emphasis, but that's the Shirazi poet within me.
I mean, drip by drip, everything gets together, it accumulates. Suddenly you have an ocean.
Suddenly you have an ocean.
That's basically what it's saying.
It's beautiful. I don't know why we love that as kids, but it was like Iranians have these sayings and some of them roll off the tongue so nicely in Farsi that this one when we were kids, because Persian uncles or Tehran Tonys will say quite poetic things. And when you're young, you haven't yet gained the knowledge to say poetic things. So this one, we kind of connected with this. We're like, I feel like an uncle. I'm just going to keep saying it. And we kept trolling each other with it, but there's a lot to be learned from that.
Wait, what did it have to do with contrast misreaction tendency?
Benjamin Franklin said, beware of little expenses. A small leak will sink a great ship.
But the context of, like, the concept of contrast misreaction is where you don't see the difference between little things, right? And then suddenly you'll see a big difference.
So it's parallels, drip by drip, it gathers, suddenly it becomes an ocean.
Parallels, it's comparisons, basically.
Exactly.
Number 17, stress influence tendency. We tend to overreact in situations when we are under heavy stress. We both know this pretty well, working in stressful environments.
I've been very susceptible to this one.
Yeah, it's funny because we have a friend who's Arya who loves to troll. Any minute of any day, he's thinking about trolling, particularly Cyrus. So he will troll Cyrus, and you can tell when Cyrus is under stress because he'll grab on, he'll react to one of Arya's who's Arya's trolls.
Same as when we were in. Even he himself reacts recently the way he's been reacting to trolls in our group chat. But when I was a corporate slave, I would be like, shut the fuck up. Like I have no patience for it. But when I'm a free person, I'm just literally, I'm reading it, I'm pissing myself. I was like, that's a brilliant troll.
When people overreact to jokes, even if they're bad, you can always understand that something's going on in their life. This one's quite useful to understand.
That's a very good one.
If people are stressed, just don't worry, they're just stressed. Number 18, availability misweighing tendency.
We tend to overvalue what's easily available to us and undervalue what's not. This is where recency bias comes from. When I'm not near the girl I love the girl I'm near. Ironically, this tendency can be used to influence people toward the right decision through presentation.
And this is why he loves checklists, right? Because he will say, like, when you're misweighing something because it's not in front of you, have a checklist of all the potential things you need to think about to ensure that this bias is not... You don't have a recency bias when it comes to evaluation. Like, think about things you haven't thought about in a while.
Number 19...
This is a good one.
Use it or lose it tendency. We tend to lose skills when we don't use them. Caveat, the skills in which we become fluent fade slower and come back faster with practice. So the solution could possibly be, achieve fluency in the skills you wish to retain and practice them regularly. A good way to do this is to make a list. Again, going back to your point of list, make a list of the skills you wish to retain. So what's important to you? I think it's not really a skill. It's a required habit, in my view, which I'm sure you'd agree with, is a development of muscle. Because especially after the age of 60, you no longer can really build muscle. And
you can build muscle. You hold it less.
But you lose, is it 1% of muscle per year or 3%?
On average, people lose muscle. Sarcopenia occurs at a faster rate in old age, but it doesn't mean you can't stop the effects of it.
Sure, and we're not going to go into the science and everything of it, but for example, a good example could be maybe listening to the Lindy podcasts, which are like audiobooks by Dr. Andy Galpin, and talks about the science side of why it's essentially a non-negotiable if you want to have a not just a long life, but also a good quality of life in old age. Why you should be not skipping weight training sessions, or also cardio for VO2 maxing, as the bros say. So these are a good way. I make a list. This is very high on the list. You wish to retain this. You can't disrupt the compounding of gym, for example, and health and fitness.
And the other thing about use it or lose it is the way in which you practice that thing is as important as practicing it. I.e., if you're just doing it to pass a test, you'll lose the skill very quickly. If you're doing it with diligence and not cramming it in, you're doing it like all the time, being diligent with the way in which you do it, then not only will that skill more likely stick, and it will lose more slowly. Like you'll definitely not lose it at a faster rate, but also if you do lose it, you can get it back faster. It's this whole concept of muscle memory, basically.
Number 20, very, very important, doesn't need much explaining. Drug misinfluence tendency.
Read it out. It just says, this tendency's destructive power is so widely known to be intense with frequent tragic consequences for cognition and the outcome of life that it needs no discussion here to supplement that previously given under simple pain avoiding psychological denial. Basically, that's all he's written.
Yeah, we tend to make irrational decisions when we are under the influence of drugs.
Basically,
there is only one solution: avoid drugs and substances at all costs,
and not just like bad, quote unquote, bad drugs. Every drug you got to. This is the whole concept of anti-fragility.
Via negativa, yes.
Number 21, senescence misinfluence tendency. This is the concept where, again, you lose not just muscle, but you lose your cognitive ability as you age, particularly in later life. Although, Munger, rest his soul, seemed sharp as ever when he was 99 or 100 or whatever.
Sharper than most 30-year-olds. And, the solution, I guess you can delay this with continual thinking and learning new skills while practicing old ones. Don't hold me to it. I read somewhere when you learn a new language as an adult, especially after the age of 25 or after the age of 30, you're training certain neurons or neural pathways in your brain that slows cognitive decline. So, that's one example. Like learning a new instrument, learning new languages, picking up new skills, especially as you age. So that's, again, he's always going back to continued learning for life.
Number 22 is very interesting. It's the concept of authority misinfluence, which is if someone has authority based on a dominance hierarchy, as you will, a lot of people talk about these dominance hierarchies, you are more likely to be listened to if you're higher up on that dominance hierarchy. So, even if they're right or wrong, there's a very good example of Sherpas and people that take tourists up Mount Everest.
Yes.
And a lot of them get listened to for right or wrong, and a lot of deaths have emerged on the basis of leaders making the wrong decision. So actually it's a life or death issue that you need to be aware of.
Number 23.
22. No, 23, yeah.
23, twaddle tendency. We tend to talk just to talk to, or because we think we know something when we actually don't. Solution: be honest with yourself about what you know and don't know. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know. And when you don't know, shut up. I mean, when I was in my mid-20s, I always talk a lot. I talk a lot now, but at least now I'm trying to improve on this. At least now it's with the asterisks of, or the subnotes of, guys, I'm just a pleb figuring it out. I really don't know anything, but I'm trying to figure it out. I really don't know a lot. And now when people ask stupid things, like, especially because we've worked in finance, people would say, what should I invest in? It's like, let's just not go there, but I don't know shit. I can't, like, first to go read Fool by Randomness. If I could pick up the box set of Inserto and slap you in the head with it, I would. But all of that aside, I don't know shit. When I was younger, I was very, susceptible to just thinking I know everything and just talking just to talk, basically. So
you still do. He says, man, he says, the best part of this is, he says, man, as a social animal who has the gift of language, is born to prattle and pour out twaddle that does much damage when serious work is being attempted. Some people produce copious amounts of twaddle and others very little. Don't produce twaddle. 24, reason respecting tendency. What's this?
We tend to embrace things that have reasons and avoid things that don't. This is so strong that even giving meaningless reasons why it can manipulate someone into doing something they shouldn't. So the solution, I guess, is validate the reasons before making a decision. I mean, unfortunately, this reason-respecting tendency is so strong that even a person's giving of meaningless or incorrect reasons will increase compliance with his orders and requests. This sort of unfortunate byproduct of reason-respecting tendency is a conditioned reflex based on a widespread appreciation of the importance of reasons.
And the final one is point number 25, the Lollapalooza tendency, what he's really famous for. So what does he say here?
Tendency to get extreme consequences from confluences of psychological tendencies acting in favor of a particular outcome.
In simple terms, what does that mean?
In simple terms is when, you have a combination of factors at play, as we said earlier, like the Coca-Cola example in this hypothetical pitch to glots. I love that fucking talk. And you're combining a multitude of factors when each of them are strong on their own, but when you combine them together, you kind of have this flywheel effect, if you will. And when tendencies combine, as an example, when tendencies combine, they are even more powerful, i.e. they're more likely to lead to bad decision making. So a lot of the tendencies we've touched on, if you start mixing some of them, it's even more powerful.
But the danger is you fall for scams that are even more... Like, this is the whole point of falling for extreme noise.
Goes
as
both
opposed
ways.
to... Yeah, you got to be careful that you're not getting the confounding elements of all of the combinations of things is not catching you off guard. Make sure you're able to just step back at times. And I think what you can do, this is where the concept of trusting your gut comes from. Like, if you feel that suddenly you're getting overwhelmed with too much compounding and confounding variables, just sit back for a second and say, okay, what does my gut feel in this situation?
Yeah. I think Taleb also touched on this gut instinct. Because it's Lindy. And, trusting your gut, stepping back.
Why is it? Is Lindy because actually historically as mammals, the way in which you would know that danger was happening was because this gut instinct would tell you that there might be a lion around the corner. So you this has been developed over time biologically.
Yeah. So as you say, take a step back, trust your gut, and have a think over it, reevaluate based on a decision-making checklist. Again, the concept of giving it some time, a checklist. Somewhere in the book talking about sleep on it for 24 hours. I think this was Buffett mentioned this when he said you want to make an important decision, or you're angry. Let's say you want to write an angry email response. All right. What works actually for some people, for me personally, type your response, but don't send it.
Yeah, do the Benjamin Disraeli thing of putting it in your drawer.
In your drawer. Then come back to the next day. In 95% plus of cases, you'll be like, I'm going to delete that draft. There's no need to send that. So the Lollapalooza tendency is incredibly important. It's a key term now, basically associated with Munger, that always comes up. It's crucial to be aware of when these multitude of factors come together and the powerful force it has when they're combined. So, big breath. That is the list of 25 tendencies in the psychology of human misjudgment.
He does give a Q&A, which we won't go into. We'll do when we do this. When we revisit this book, we'll go into detail of all of the talks revisited. We'll look at the Q&As in more detail. And then, by the way, there's an appendix, man, that is just so amazing that he picks up on some of the points that he's mentioned throughout the book.
Exactly. So as I said, the psychology of human misjudgment does deserve its own episode in the future, in more depth. In the Q&A section, to wrap up this talk, or this long essay section, if you will, Munger, there's one highlighted paragraph I have which is brilliant to wrap it all up. This pretty much to wrap up the book, I would say. It says, I once much enjoyed an occasion of this sort. I drew this beautiful woman as my dinner partner many years ago. I'd never seen her before. She was married to a prominent Los Angeles man. She sat down next to me, turned her beautiful face up and said, Charlie, what one word accounts for your remarkable success in life? I knew I was being manipulated by a practiced routine, and I just loved it. I never see this woman without a little lift in my spirits. And by the way, I told her I was irrational. You'll have to judge yourself whether that's true. I may be demonstrating some psychological tendency I hadn't planned on demonstrating.
No one is immune to all of these issues.
Indeed.
And if you want to learn more about psychological tendencies, learn from all of these great authors that have helped us develop our thinking at Rational VC.
The greatest minds in history. Every episode we explore a Lindy book and find ideas you can apply to business and life.
Then sign up at rationalvc.com. Sign up to our newsletter, where we provide you an overview from our perspective and experiences of the books that we go through and we study.
Yeah, I mean, we do this for free, for no money whatsoever. It's a lot of work, 50 plus hours, some episodes 70, 80 plus hours in all the, from start to finish, all the prep, all the post-production, all the editing, all the distribution, everything. So if you liked it, just hit the follow on Spotify and hit the 5 stars. And then same thing on YouTube. Leave a thumbs up, subscribe and comment, and that'll do a lot. Rationalvc.com. You will get exclusive essays and access to exclusive material, AMAs, and also access to some stuff we're going to be launching soon, which is like let's say a community you can join in a closed private chat, and events and meetups. So that's it. Rationalvc.com. Anything else to add?
As Munger says, I have nothing to add.
Chucks.